Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story. My neighbor has been paying me to spend time with him. There's some weird stuff happening at his place. I had known Farmer Ben long before I started working for him. Every Saturday morning, he could be found ass naked on top of his barn, screaming louder than his lungs should have allowed him and shaking his fists at the sky. Sometimes he'd be shouting obscenities. Other times it'd just be high-pitched howls of both joy and fury. On the plus side, for me who lived right across the street from him, he made for a solid replacement for my alarm clock, since my bedroom window was facing the barn, and therefore Ben in all of his glory. The first thing I'd do would be drawing the blinds, in case I hadn't the night before. On those days, I would often wonder about this odd man. For example, I would have loved to know how exactly he'd gotten up on top of that barn in his obviously intoxicated state, and how he always managed not to fall off. Had I not observed him do this over and over again, I would have been a lot more worried for him. That was all though. For the rest of the week, he'd keep a fairly low profile and I'd often encounter him outside. He'd greet politely, lifting or tipping his ball cap each time, and bid me good day. Sometimes, we would talk about small, random things, like how my aunt was doing or how business was getting on for Ben himself. But it's not like we really knew each other. As for me, I lived with my uncle back then. My parents had separated and I knew I had to find somewhere else to stay being in my mid-20s. I figured it was high time for me to move out either way. While my other relatives' places weren't what I'd had in mind, I had always gotten along very well with my aunt and uncle. So when the former fell ill, I agreed to come over and help her husband take care of her. I quit my job to move in with them, but that wasn't too tragic of a loss. I took up work in the area here and there, enough to earn some good cash but nothing stable. That was until Lucy, my aunt, passed away. The day of her death was one of the saddest of my entire life. But I can't even begin to imagine how it must have been for my Uncle John. He was never quite the same afterwards. He became a husk of his former self, going about his day in an almost trance-like state, his eyes always glazed and the look on his face apathetic. I tried to be somewhat of a comforting presence, but despite my best efforts, I hardly ever managed to lift his mood. Sure, there'd be better days occasionally, but I suppose the loss of his wife was simply too much for him. While I understood that, it hurt seeing him this grief-stricken. It was on one of those days that I was walking up the hill back to my uncle's house after spending the noon at work in town, helping out at a nearby cafe, one of those little part-time jobs of mine. I was lost in thought when I heard the clopping of hooves on the pavement behind me, and upon turning around saw Farmer Ben, leading the largest, fattest horse I'd ever seen. He greeted me with a friendly wave as he and the giant animal kept approaching. I like horses a lot, and the bigger, the better, so this was obviously something that warranted special attention. I stayed still so they could catch up with me before falling into pace with them. "I didn't know you had horses," I said. "I don't," Ben replied. "Just this one, and I only got it today." "It's huge," I remarked. "Never seen a Belgian draft horse before?" "Oh, is that what you call these?" I don't know. I guess. It looks like one. But I'm not an expert. He replied. I don't even like horses. To be honest. Do you? He gave me a quick sidelong glance before adding. Do you want to sit on it? I nodded eagerly and immediately tried to crawl my way up on the large horse's back. Ben ended up having to give me a bit of a lift, but eventually I managed to climb on top. He then started leading us along again while I patted the beast's neck. I'm not hurting it, am I? Since it doesn't have its saddle on. Please. It's twice your size. I don't think it knows you're up there at all. Even so, this isn't exactly a normal horse. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Nothing at all. He paused. I may or may not have stolen it from a certain asshole I know. But don't worry. He deserved it. All right. So I guess the cops are gonna show up around here sometime soon? They won't. Don't worry. How's your uncle holding up? I sighed. Feels like he's getting worse every day. To be honest, he won't even talk to me anymore. I know he needs his space and I'm trying to respect that, but I just wish it didn't have to be that way. He's lucky he's got someone who wants to talk to him. Ben answered. You know, if you have some of that talk to people kinda energy pent up inside you, you could always talk to me instead. I'd pay you. I just stared at him from atop the giant horse for a little while. I wasn't sure what to say. I thought he was joking. He held my gaze, looking quite serious indeed. I'm not a counselor. I finally told him. I'm not looking for a counselor. I don't want a professional opinion. I just want someone to listen to me. Treat me like a friend. A friend you'd give money to? You say it as if it's a bad thing. Ben said, money's good. Keeps people alive and connected. It sounds weird. I get that. But I mean it. You'd be doing something that seems to come easy to you, and I'm not kidding with the payment. I've got 2 employees helping me with the farm as well. If you want a friend, why not reach out the normal way? Why pay someone? I'm not an idiot. I have my reasons. Okay? This is my offer. Take it or leave it. Since I'm telling people about this, you may have already guessed what I chose to do. It took me a while to come to the decision, and I had to sleep on it for a night or 2. But eventually I ended up in front of his doorstep late in the afternoon. Ben was happy enough to let me in, and we sat down in his kitchen. I hadn't seen much of his place yet, but it looked very nice. It was rustic and old, but in an incredibly charming way. Just what you'd imagine from a classic farmhouse. Judging from the fine, yet slightly worn curtains, drapes and tablecloths which adorned the living room, hallway and dining room, someone had apparently once made an effort to pretty up his home. But all the decorations had faded and grown dull. I couldn't help but wonder why none of them had been replaced. This is a bit awkward, right? Ben asked, holding my gaze from across the kitchen table we were sitting at. He carefully nudged a cup of hot milk over to me, which he'd poured me after I'd turned down the offer of coffee. Could be worse. Your place is really nice, I said, giving him a soft smile. I reached for the cup and folded my hands around it to warm up my palms. Ben shifted in his seat, taking a sip of his coffee. I think we should clear up some things first. He cleared his throat. Well, there's some ideas to be had about the job I'm offering you here. I don't want you to feel like, okay, let's cut this short. I'm a weirdo, aren't I? I offered him an uncertain smile. I wanted you to answer that question. He told me. Oh, well, yes, a little bit. Ben smiled. It's okay. I'm aware of that. You know, I don't really care what other people think or say about me, okay? Maybe I care a little bit. Just not that much. Well, sometimes I do care a lot. Not the point. I want you to know that I expect absolutely nothing but some conversation from you. No other ways of entertainment. If you catch my drift. I nodded. I didn't think you wanted that. Not really. It did cross your mind. Didn't it? It did, I admitted. But I think you would have just said so outright if that's what you wanted. And you wouldn't have asked me. There's people who do that for a living after all. No one would just suggest it to their neighbors. Ben stifled a snort. I guess not. I'm glad you didn't feel that way though. I gotta ask though, why me? Why a woman in the first place? Wouldn't you rather hang out with a guy? Ben sighed and his shoulders dropped. Actually, no. I feel a lot more comfortable talking to women. I'm not sure why that is. There's some stuff that happened when I was younger that would probably explain it, but I don't want to go into that. At least not yet. And why don't you want to talk to a therapist? That'd probably be a better option. I mean, I can't really help you if you're not feeling well. All I can do is listen. I thought we were past this. I want some warmth. Someone to talk to me and get to know me. Who I can get to know as well. I don't want help. Hell, I don't think I need help. I feel fine. Actually, I feel really good about myself. There's other reasons too, but I'll leave it at that for now. Alright, I took a sip of my milk. Okay then. Where do you normally start with these things? We did discover a point to start from eventually. Talking to Ben turned out to be surprisingly easy. He had a witty streak to him, though his humor was largely self-deprecating, which was kind of surprising seeing as he otherwise came off as pretty confident. I was really enjoying myself. Actually, a few hours had passed before I knew it, and I already felt a bit closer to him. Close enough to ask about the horse. Ben grinned. Oh, yeah, it's doing very well, I think. If it's missing its owner, it's not letting it on. Oh, and it's a he. Does he have a name? If he does, I wouldn't know. You can name him if you'd like. It would be an honor. I replied with a smirk. So who does he belong to? Just this guy the first really hate. Let's call him my archenemy. To give you the gist of it, he's done something bad, as in, too awful to tell you right now. We have a bit of an ongoing fight. See, he takes things that are mine. I take things that are his. The usual, he explained casually. Oh, the usual, I repeated. I know I'm interesting, but I really can't tell you. He told me, chuckling as he shook his head, quickly glancing out the window. He frowned. It's dark already. Look at that. It's pouring too. We stared out the window for a few minutes, listening to the rain drumming on the glass. You're right, Ben said. Finally, he fell silent again for a little while. I really don't want to send you out there. I know it's right across the street, but you'll catch death. If you'd like, I've got a bunch of spare rooms here. Guest rooms. I keep them clean just in case some of my obnoxious kin decide to pop over unannounced. Why don't you pick one for the night? I'd like that, I muttered. The weather really did look nasty. Ben led me up the stairs and into a very nice, well-furnished bedroom. I took note of the old-fashioned striped wallpaper. The large floor lamp in the corner and the folding screen in the back. It was almost a bit like a hotel room, but a very expensive one. After saying our goodbyes, Ben trudged back down the stairs and I heard a door slamming shut, followed by the sound of a lock clicking. I found the key to my own room atop the drawer next to the door, and I figured I'd better lock up as well. I had never spent the night at a stranger's place before, though I couldn't really call him that anymore. Still, it was odd, though I can't say I was uneasy in any way. Actually, I felt kind of at home. After partially undressing, I dropped down on the bed. The sheets were clean and smelled lovely. There was a window right there by the bedside, so I could look out at the moon as I drifted off to sleep. It was all rather peaceful. I fell into a deep, pleasant slumber after what could have hardly been more than 20 minutes. I was startled awake by a loud bang. I jolted upright, my heart dropping to my stomach. The banging continued, noisy and incessant, and in my haze, it took me a second or two to realize where it was coming from. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something bright, something moving, and I slowly turned my head to the window beside me. There was a face staring back at me. Right there, right outside. It was that of a young woman. Her fist was raised up to the glass as she kept on slamming it against the window pane. She held my gaze with bright blue eyes. They were so wide and big they almost looked unnatural, and the look within them was one of utter horror. Suddenly, her mouth twisted into an open grimace and she began to cry out to me. "Let me in," she shrieked, her voice as high as the howls of the wind outside. "Let me in," I gasped, backing away from the window and falling off the bed in the process. The voice of the girl outside rose to an even higher pitch and the banging grew louder and stronger, almost as if she was trying to smash in the window. How was she even standing at the window? We weren't on ground level. Either she was incredibly tall or she was clinging to the wall outside. Both options I found highly disturbing. "You're in my house, she wailed, now sounding furious. "Let me in." By then she'd lifted her other fist to the glass as well and was basically throwing her entire upper body against it. It took me way too long to pick myself up from the floor and step up to the door. I began fumbling with the key, my heart pounding in my chest even faster than the woman was pounding on the window pane. Finally, I flung the door open and burst out into the hallway, calling Ben's name over and over again. He was already up, the stranger's cries having roused him as well, and he was on his way up the stairs as I jumped up and down at the top. To my surprise, he looked like he was utterly unfazed by the noise. There was not a trace of confusion or fear on his face as he gently nudged me aside and boldly strode into my room, myself following cautiously. "What's going on?" I whimpered, trying to sound less scared than I actually was. "Hush," he said softly. He leaned over the bed, staring right at the woman's face, and proceeded to tear open the window so forcefully I thought it'd break right out of the frame. "Fuck off," he roared at the top of his lungs. His voice was so deep, throaty and ear-piercing that for a few moments, it seemed to drown out all the sounds of the wind and rain outside. It took me a second to realize that I hadn't gone deaf. Ben cleared his throat, stepped away from the window, shut it and pulled his dressing gown a bit tighter around his shoulders. The woman had disappeared. I took slow, deep breaths, Trying to calm myself down, Ben came up to me, giving me an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry you had to see this. Don't worry, it's not gonna happen again for the rest of the night, so if you'd like, you can just go back to sleep, or pick another room, or get dressed and come watch TV with me. I most likely won't be able to go back to sleep. I never manage after this happens." "Wait, you mean this is a regular thing?" He just shrugged and made his way back downstairs. I did join him in his living room in the end. He didn't say a word about what had just transpired, but his demeanor remained pleasant and unchanged. That was the first time we hung out together, with many more and much weirder stuff yet to come. A few days into my arrangement with Ben, my neighbor who had approached me and offered to pay me for my company. We were still keeping things, as he called it, casual. It was apparently a bit of a challenge for him to get used to me. And here I had been thinking I was easy to talk and attuned to. When I asked Ben if there was anything I could do to make him feel more comfortable, he said it wasn't my fault at all. There's no two people who just instantly click. He explained to me with surprising conviction. No. Did you ever just connect with anybody just like that? Sure I did, I said, with a lot of people. Actually, I told him a bit about the friends I'd made during my school days, some of which I was still in contact with, and about the girls and guys I'd met at my various jobs, the gym and such. Ben and I were sitting inside a cafe at the time, a large one outside of town which focused solely on serving pancakes and waffles. He'd ordered both of us enormous piles of either and was listening intently as he chewed. Eventually, he let out a small hum and, his mouth still full, replied, "Then I guess it just depends on the person. Of course it's easy for you to make friends. You're agreeable, approachable." He took a sip of his coffee. "It's just something I noticed. Whenever I see you around outside, even when you're by yourself, you always have a smile on your face." He leaned forward a bit. I wondered, "Do you do that on purpose?" "Not really," I answered, a tad uncertain. "I don't even think about it." "Do I really?" He nodded. For a moment, neither of us said a word. Finally, Ben lifted his coffee mug and took a sip. "So you're just a happy person then? That's good for you. Good for me, too. I'd hoped to learn a thing or two. Is that why you asked me specifically to do this with you?" He shrugged. "It's a part of why." I sighed. I was already starting to get used to not getting my questions answered, but it was still a bit irritating. Upon informing Ben of this, he simply laughed and said he was a generally irritating person. At that point, I'd already taken somewhat of a liking to him, but I couldn't deny that his self-assessment was perfectly accurate. I was just thinking about this when from the side, an older woman came walking up to us. She was in her late 40s or early 50s, slender and attractive in a stern, handsome way. She looked like a spokesperson for office supplies. She was certainly wearing the clothes for it. "Mr. Benjamin Cox," she said steadfastly. Her voice was strangely soft and gentle, but in a cold, impersonal way, aloof. I felt myself recoiling at the sound of it. It instantly put me off. Something about her wasn't right. Perhaps it was that empty, joyless smile of hers that made my skin crawl. She looked like a living human mannequin, giving me the impression that she acted out friendliness instead of meaning it. Ben looked up at her. his formerly pleased expression quickly changing into a similarly distant one. "You," he replied, his tone matter-of-factly. "Didn't I tell you to call me on the phone if you want anything?" "Sure you did. I wasn't planning on meeting you here. It's quite shocking to see you have company," the lady told him, a hint of condescension in her monotonous voice. "And who's this, now?" She gave me a curious look. "Caradwin," I answered, reaching out to shake her hand. For some reason, I felt like I wasn't supposed to give her my last name too. Else she'd say them both when addressing me just like she'd done with Ben. Plus, she really gave me the creeps. She pressed my hand instead of shaking it. "Enchante." Turning to Ben, she added, "I hope I wasn't interrupting anything." "What do you want?" he asked curtly. "I need you to get something done. As usual. Then tell me about it on the phone. Later." The lady smiled mirthlessly. "Will do. I can take a hint. I didn't want to be a bother. I just saw you here and wanted to come over." "Sure you did. Now that that's over." Ben made a waving off motion with his hand and the lady chuckled, turned on her heel and walked out the door. It swung shut behind her and Ben sank deeper into his seat, his whole body deflating in a deep, heavy sigh. "Your last name isn't Cox," I began. "I know," he replied casually, taking a sip of his coffee. "She doesn't know my actual last name. Cox is an alias. It was rather clever of you not to give out yours either. It's good to pay attention to anonymity. You ought to be careful around people like her." "So, people like her," I repeated blankly. "What kind of people would that be?" Ben gave me a wry smirk. "She calls herself Daisy. I know almost as little about her as you do, and I'm not keen on finding out more." "But, have you noticed that I have a ton of money? More than most farmers around here?" "Well, of course you've noticed. If I hadn't, you wouldn't be sitting here. Either way, she's the reason for that. I work for her, or rather, my pigs do. I have a few of them. Maybe you've seen or smelled them before." "Mostly smelled," I confirmed. "How exactly are your pigs working for her?" Ben exhaled sharply. "You ask tough questions, young lady. I'm not sure if it'd be fruitful to tell you all about that now." "Are you gonna tell me at all?" "Sure I will. Actually, I think I really should. It's just a difficult topic. Not exactly something you'd discuss over waffles." I looked down at my plate, watching almost passively as my hands led my cutlery to cut off a piece of the uppermost waffle on my pile. Ben was a fast eater, and he was almost done with his portion while I still had about half of mine left. I mumbled some words of acceptance to his explanation before starting to eat again. Once Ben took up as well. He'd cleared his plate within seconds. It was sort of like watching a magic trick. The way he made all the food disappear. Feeling full, I offered him the rest on my plate. We didn't speak of the matter anymore that day. The next time it came up was while we were on the road, returning home from spending an afternoon at a lake an hour or two away. I had made that particular suggestion since the place was really pretty and Ben seemed to need somewhere to relax. There were other people at the lake as well, but thankfully rather few, so all in all, the atmosphere was calm and soothing. I'd thought he'd like to take a swim as well, but he ended up merely sitting by the lakeside while I splashed around in the water. He appeared to be fully content with that though, and by the end of our stay, he looked happy and satisfied. That was a great idea, he told me as we climbed into his car. I never knew there was a spot like that out here. The drive home was pretty nice at first. We were talking a little, although I was a little tired, and listened to the radio. Then his cell phone rang. Ben's car is a bit old-fashioned, a true beauty but not up to all modern standards. It doesn't have a speaker, so he asked me to take the call. I did, obediently greeting the person on the other end. "Well, hello there, you're not Mr. Cox." I didn't recognize the voice right away, but it did sound familiar. I turned up the volume and held the phone out so Ben could hear it better. "I'm not," I replied, "but he's with me. He's driving." "I see. Caradwin, was it? The girl from the coffee house. How are you doing, sweetheart?" The weird lady, Daisy. I remembered her now. For some reason, it sounded like she was grinning. I could figuratively hear it in her voice. I didn't know how to respond, for some reason. Listening to her speak with this mock affection really unnerved me. The same seemed to be the case with Ben. "Leave her alone. What do you want?" he growled. "Why so serious?" she replied, obviously not expecting an answer, seeing as she carried on right away. "I've got a job for you. The cargo's in the same place as always. Go pick it up, would you? Thanks a bunch," she piped. That was all she said before abruptly ending the call. I set aside the phone, turning to Ben with a look of utter bewilderment. He let out a deep sigh, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "We're taking a detour, it seems," he eventually told me. "To where? It's nothing to do with you. Don't worry, just gotta pick up some stuff. You said you were tired earlier, if you want to sleep." I wouldn't mind. He briefly reached into the back of the car and pulled out a little pillow from right behind his seat. He handed it to me with an encouraging smile. "Go ahead if you'd like. I'll drive carefully." I was still confused, but there was no reason not to take a nap. I knew Ben did some odd jobs, but who was I to judge, let alone interfere? I didn't really want to think about it either. I simply figured it was none of my business, seeing as this lady was really freaking me out as well. I wasn't eager to put my nose where it didn't belong. I placed the pillow beside me and rested my head on it. Seeing as I was exhausted from swimming, I drifted off to sleep rather quickly. I don't know for how long I'd been out for, but I woke up to the sounds of the car slowing down, rumbling and groaning as it pulled up somewhere. I heard Ben clear his throat, muttering to himself as he got out and gently shut the door behind himself. I really wanted to fall back asleep so I didn't alert him to me being awake. It's easier to nap when you're pretending to do so already. There was no way I could overhear or ignore the noise of something heavy being lifted into the trunk, though. Ben let out a muffled grunt as the car seemed to sink down a little before he closed the trunk. He climbed back inside and buckled up again. Before starting the car, however, he quietly said my name, like he was checking if I was still asleep. When I replied with a curt, "Yes," he almost jumped in his seat. "I thought you were sleeping," he panted once he'd finally calmed down. "Was that necessary?" "Yes." I grinned a bit. "Okay. Well, sorry for the detour. I'm sure you're about ready to go home." "I am." Looking up, I found that we were parked out front of a gas station. A dingy, crusty old thing that looked like it hadn't attracted any customers in years. Why so nervous? Where are we anyway? This is the normal pickup site. Not many people coming here. Except me and Daisy, he explained as he pulled out onto the road again. It was then that I realized how far away we were from basically everything. There were no buildings anywhere in sight, just wide stretches of desolate landscape overgrown with dried out grass. "What's in the trunk?" I asked, now with a mix of curiosity and caution. I had already figured there was something a little shady going on. But it was the kind of consideration that you keep in the back of your mind and don't actually like to think about. I guess I simply hadn't thought it could truly be something sinister. It's simply like that with these dealings, you know they happen somewhere. Involving people you'll never meet. But you wouldn't believe it's ever anywhere close to you. I don't think you want to know. Ben said, eyes on the road. It'd be way easier for you not to know. But I'd keep wondering about it and it would bother me. I argued. Ben chuckled, but it sounded bitter and joyless. I'm not gonna try and make it a big secret, he told me. Plus, you kind of have the right to find out, seeing as I'm trying to keep you around. Still, please take me seriously when I'm warning you about this. I do take you seriously. And you're sure you want to know? I think so, I stammered. I mean, it'd be better if I knew. I guess. Ben sighed, his gaze darkening. But he said nothing. So what is it? He shrugged, suddenly pulling over to the side of the road. There were absolutely no other cars except ours. So I wasn't reluctant when Ben motioned for us to climb outside. Now, he began as we rounded the car. You insisted on seeing this. Keep that in mind. And please remember that I'm in no way proud of this. But let's just say I can live with it. I don't mind talking about it either. No one cares as long as I don't call the cops. Which you shouldn't do either. Trust me, nothing good will come of it. They have ties to law enforcement, and if all else fails, the best lawyers at their beck and call. So they'll end up free and you'll end up dead. That's for certain. I was starting to feel a bit queasy. Ben opened the car's trunk. Inside lay a large black bag. With a stoically calm hand, Ben reached for the zipper and slowly pulled it down before lifting one side of the bag up, granting a view of its contents. The first thing I saw was a hand. It seemed to stretch from the depths of its prison like a tree extending its branches in search of sunlight. It didn't move though. It was as still and motionless as a doll's hand. At first I didn't even realize what I was looking at. I leaned over just a bit more, and that's when I saw that the hand had been severed at the wrist. My heart sank and I felt my stomach turn. For a second, I was too stunned to move or speak. I would have screamed had I been able to. Beneath the hand, I saw more fleshy parts peeking out, small enough they'd probably had to have been poured into the bag. The blood they'd been oozing had pooled in several places at the bottom of the bag. I instinctively clutched my arms around my chest and shoulders, hugging myself as though that would keep my body from falling apart in the same way. I had never been so aware of the beat of my pulse and the forming of cold sweat on my palms and brow. I could literally feel it on my skin. I was dizzy, nauseous. I didn't feel stable on my feet anymore. Kind of like the ground was giving way beneath me. It had to be the most intense feeling of dread I'd ever experienced up to that point. "You all right?" Ben asked, quite casually, as though the sight we were facing was nothing out of the ordinary. No, I had to force the word out, my lips quivering. Let me just close all that up again, there, out of sight. Out of mind, right? Not quite, I muttered, now staring blankly at the outside of the car's trunk. Never seen anything dead up to now. Have you? Squirrels, frogs, a deer, all on the road, various insects. I stammered, still not able to form full sentences. I tried to keep down the bile which had risen in my throat, swallowing hard and wincing at the biting pain it sent through my chest. Not a dead person though. It was more of a statement than a question, and Ben voiced it without really addressing me, like he was saying it so I didn't have to. I just nodded and buried my face in one of my palms. The pressure of my fingertips on my cheeks and jaw was slightly soothing. Ben cleared his throat uncomfortably. I didn't know you'd take it this badly. I didn't mean to make you feel sick. I'm very sorry. It's okay, I said, digging my fingers further into my skin. I'm not gonna have nightmares. Don't worry, I added, trying to put on a jovial tone. I don't know why I tried to sound like it didn't bother me, but I felt like I needed to, almost as though if I'd pretend not to be absolutely horrified, I'd actually calm down. That's only part of what I was worried about. Still a great comfort though. Honestly, if it helps. That guy in there, he got involved with Daisy and her whatever they are, so he's no saint either. Also, he would have died anyways. I'm just here mopping up the mess. If it wasn't for me, there'd be some other clown doing it. So, if you're wondering if you should feel bad about this, or guilty, just don't. It'd be pointless, he explained. It sounded more like something he was telling himself though, not me. I wondered if he actually believed it. This is bad, this is really, really bad, I muttered, more to myself than him. I perceived a sudden sting of panic as another terrifying thought crossed my mind. Does she know where you live? Daisy. I mean, what if you do something wrong? What if she comes after you? Or me? I'm not in any danger. And neither are you. Daisy only tells me what to do. She's never seen my home or the pigs. There's a middleman, so to speak, who got her into contact with me. And he's a personal acquaintance. But other than that, I try to make sure I'm not spoken of in those circles. He sighed. It's a cute little illusion. If she wanted to, if I gave her a reason, Daisy could come after me at once. So I don't give her a reason. Plus, I need the money. I really do. Why? I inquired sharply. Why the fuck would you do this? You do have enough money, right? Like, even without them. Enough money to live, yes. But I need more. Way more. What in the world for? Ben let out a sound that, when typed out, borders on illegible. Something like NJESH. I could only interpret it as him letting me know that he wasn't ready to tell me yet. It's a good reason, he eventually told me. It really is. I promise. I don't like doing this. And if I didn't feel like I have to, I wouldn't. Please don't think otherwise. Not for 1 second. But my reason, it's a level of crazy you're not ready for yet. I'm getting you there, slowly, one step at a time. Ben somehow manages to look a lot older than he actually is. He has this air of exhaustion around him, and the bags under his eyes make him look like he never sleeps. On some days, he'll look younger and more lively. And on other days, he'll look even worse. So I know it's a fluctuating thing. I used to consider him to be in his mid-40s. And for that he'd be faintly handsome. But as it turned out, He was 36 at the time of me bringing up that subject. I was 28, and very apologetic. I swear I didn't mean that. I told him for the 10th time after my former impression of his age had slipped out of me by accident. It's not all that bad. Really. He replied, his lips tight and his gaze unwavering. But he looked unhappy nonetheless. When talking about Ben's outward appearance, I should probably mention some other peculiarities as well, namely his build and choice of clothing. Ben is a giant of a man, towering above the majority of people, but not quite tall enough to look abnormal. He has the shoulders and back of an ox, yet he's not in shape, in the way a bodybuilder or an athlete would be. While he is muscular, his strength is rooted in the work he does on the field and with his animals. And that shows mostly on his arms and a lot less over the rest of his body. I wouldn't go so far as to say that he has a gut, but he is on the chubbier side. All in all, his frame amounts to someone who, if angry at you, will make you crap your pants. His taste in fashion ranges from gracefully careless to downright deplorable. He doesn't seem to make an effort to dress up very often. More like he simply gets up in the morning and throws on whatever he can find. He's also got an emotional attachment to a certain old, faded red ball cap. The words, "Communism was just a red herring," are scrawled onto its front with what I'm guessing is black marker. It's not written in his hand. Mind you, over the duration of our acquaintance, I've received quite a few letters and notes from him on paper, so I'm familiar with the way he writes. Surprisingly enough, it's impeccable, almost majestic. He applies way too much pressure on the paper though, which would often make the ink seep through. But that's literally the only thing I can think of that's wrong with his handwriting. Other than that, it's perfect in both legibility and artistry. When I asked him who it was that had further defaced his ball cap, he didn't want to tell me. We were already a few months into our arrangement when I discovered something strange in his home. I had been coming over quite frequently and I thought I'd seen everything there was to his house. That was until I found that one of the doors on the upper floor was locked. Up until then, I'd just assumed it was another guest room he hadn't shown me yet. But of course, there would be no reason for a guest room to be locked. Of course I asked him about it, and he once again refused to give me an answer. I do think he wanted me to find out though, seeing as just a week later, he left me to watch his house while he was out of town. My uncle's dying or something I heard. He told me I should really be there with balloons or whatever. Balloons? I repeated. Or maybe a cake. I don't know. What do you bring when someone you absolutely hate but pretend to tolerate for family's sake is bedridden? I guess it depends on what message you want to send them. I wouldn't recommend either though. To be honest, I replied hesitantly. You're probably right. His shoulders dropped in disappointment. He's awful. You know, he's done some shit. It'd take too long to explain, but he's not a good guy and... His voice trailed off as he let out a deep sigh. Well, I'm just gonna pretend like I'm not enjoying this. You frighten me, I said flatly. I don't. His tone was so convinced and casual that all I could do was nod. Either way, for as long as I'm gone, 2 days, I believe, you can do whatever you want in here. My farm hands are gonna take care of business, so don't worry about that. I'd just like for you to watch out for the house and keep it warm. I feel so weird coming back here after being away for longer than a couple hours. It's just so empty then. A slight shudder shook his shoulders at the sheer thought of it. No worries, I assured him. All right, you know where everything is, so help yourself to whatever you'd like. No locked doors or cabinets either. What's mine is yours. Go ahead and make a mess. I literally don't care. Just remember, if you want to sit around here in your underwear, I do that too. I snorted, despite him looking dead serious. And with that he was off. The first thing I did was sit down to watch TV. Ben has this giant television and the best, most comfortable sofa. It used to be quite pretty too. But there's a bunch of beer stains on it now. He's a sloppy drinker. I sat there for about 2 hours until I got tired of the cooking show that was on. And my mind drifted back to what he'd told me upon his departure. No locked doors. I immediately sat up. What had he meant by that? I needed to go check. I dashed up the stairs, all the way to the far end of the hallway where the room he apparently hadn't wanted me to go into was located, and reached out for the door handle. I pressed it down, pulled, and the door swung open. My heart almost jumped in my chest. I took a step back, wishing to allow the room to open up to me on its own. Bit by bit, flashes of rosy, pastel colors were revealed. I spotted a well-made bed with flower prints on its light pink sheets. Large pillows and a few plushies neatly lined up between them. There was an ornate armoire in the corner, one of a rich, dark brown color, and a bookshelf right beside it. It was slightly bent, probably due to the enormous weight it was holding. There were dozens of books stacked in varying layers on top of it. Much more than it was meant to carry. Still, it was bravely hanging in there. A striped, soft carpet covered the better part of the floor. The desk leaning against the wall to the right was laden with even more books. And the chair in front of it was decorated with fairy lights that had carefully been wrapped around it. The whole room looked unreal in its daintiness and fragility, like something out of a dollhouse. This was most certainly not a guest room. It had personality. Someone had used and lived in it. Someone with a distinctly feminine taste and touch. Definitely not Ben. There was something about this room that put me off. I couldn't figure out what it was exactly. But I was overcome by the sudden and intense notion that I wasn't meant to be in there. It felt like I was intruding upon someone, or not giving the owner their deserved privacy. Despite there being no one around, the sensation sent a shiver down my spine. But at the same time, something else seemed to figuratively pull me further inside. Like there was something I was supposed to see or do in here. I just didn't know what it was. I cautiously took another step inside, then another. I kept looking back over my shoulder to see if the door was still open. For some reason, I felt like it was going to slam shut all of a sudden and trap me inside that room. Of course it didn't, but the thought was still enough to make me nervous. I didn't know what to investigate first. I hurriedly examined the covers of some of the dozens of books lying around on the desk and shelves. To my surprise, they appeared to be textbooks on medicine. Some were about the history of specific hospitals, others about anatomy, and again others about medical practices in times past. The only works of fiction among this highly professional assortment were a couple of classics. The kinds of books you'd be forced to read at school. They were all visibly well loved and had been read multiple times. judging by the signs of wear and tear on their covers and backs. Looking around further, I spotted a cardboard box peeking out from under the bed. I got down on my knees to grab it and slowly pulled it out. There wasn't a lot of dust on top of it, like it was taken out and put back on a regular basis. I didn't know why, but touching it made me feel uneasy, like there was a chill being sent out from the surface of the box right through my fingertips and up into my hands before spreading all throughout my body. I swallowed, took a deep breath, inhaling the stale, thick warm air and regretting it instantly, and peeled open the box. My stomach dropped. My hands instinctively jerked up to cover my mouth, stifling a scream I could have let go of just as well. There was nobody home but me after all. Inside the box, laid out and stacked up with no small amount of precision and care, were bones. They ranged from being tiny, slim and fragile to heavy and long. I have next to no knowledge of anatomy, but I was sure I could spot just about everything from finger bones to thighs, ribs and shins in there. A single skull thrown atop the pile, its empty sockets staring back at me kind of like it was watching me from its place on that morbid podium. For a few moments, all I could do was sit and stare at the contents of the box, frozen in place with my hands still clasping my mouth. My mind raced. I had seen a dead body before, or at least parts of it. Ben had shown me the one he'd been supposed to destroy. This sight was enough to send my head reeling, despite the first one being arguably worse. Don't get me wrong, I hadn't forgotten about Ben's part-time job. I had simply decided that it was not healthy to get involved. Call me heartless, but I felt little guilt not reporting him. I did feel bad, very bad, but I had a good reason to stay as far away from this side job of his as possible. I didn't want to stop associating with him. Mind you, that part one can't even explain to myself after all this time. It's really the sort of thing that'd make you turn your back on a friend, even if that meant passing up money, which in my case at least was very much needed. Why I wasn't as appalled as I most likely should have been, I'll never know. Anyways, it sucked knowing that he did these cleanups, but sticking my nose where it didn't belong could end up curing me of life in this case. That I was sure of. And yet these bones were different. They didn't belong to anybody, or anybody Ben had been hired to get rid of. The way they had been set aside in that box, all carefully, almost lovingly, just screamed that there was something else going on. Spotting another small object in the corner of the box, I reached out and picked it up. It was a flat, gray stone. To my surprise, there were words carved into it. The letters were neat and clearly legible, making me wonder how in the world someone had managed to squeeze them into such a hard and small surface. The writing read, "Little Benjamin is a rotten boy." I eyed the stone as I held it. It was oddly heavy to me, and despite feeling a strange, sickening sense of unease at the sheer sight, I couldn't help but read the message on it over and over again. I finally managed to get my trembling hands to put everything back, shut the box and slide it back under the bed where I'd found it. My heart was still pounding in my chest with a strength that suggested it wanted to burst out from inside it. I made my way downstairs, not before gently pressing the door closed behind me. I needed to go see Butler. That's what I'd named the giant stallion Ben had stolen from this mysterious archenemy of his. There were a couple stables at the farm which most likely had been in use before Ben took over. They had been intact enough to harbor the horse in. Anyway, it had a striking coat coloring I think can be referred to as snowflake. It was of a dark gray. Black in places, but covered with tiny white spots. I had come to grow very fond of Butler. Perhaps because I'd been the one to name it. I had gladly been helping Ben take care of it. Sure, he'd abducted it and I was probably implicating myself somehow by supporting that kind of behavior in him. But I just couldn't help it. Butler was adorable. Besides, he really didn't appear to care all that much that he was away from home and in the hands of a bunch of strangers. I think he might have even liked it. We made sure he was always well fed, groomed and happy, and I'd begun to practice riding him. It worked very well. He carried me with an almost knowing reverence, like he was used to having inexperienced riders on his back and wanted me to be okay. Long story short, Butler was amazing. A freaking good horse. That's also how I came up with his name. His attention to manners just struck me as peculiar. He was also really good at calming me down. Maybe petting him was good luck. But either way, I would always feel better after. So I went down to the stables where Butler was resting at the time. I'd taken an apple as a snack for him which he carefully ate right out of my hand. Afterwards, I let him out, feeling confident enough to lead him on my own without Ben or one of his workers to help me. Butler's presence was comforting. Petting his enormous neck, I walked along beside him, talking partly to myself and partly to him. I felt like Ben's life was way too complicated for me to understand. There was so much he wasn't telling me. But at the same time, him leaving me there was proof in itself that he wanted me to find out. He just didn't want to put it all into words himself. And somehow, this horse had to fit into that entire mess. When Ben came home from visiting his family, he looked exhausted. Not the kind of exhausted you were after driving for hours on end, but more like all the life had been sucked out of his body. When I opened the door for him, he made a show of collapsing into my arms, the sudden pressure of his weight on my shoulders making me stagger. "I'm dying," he said into my neck. Really, I struggled to hold him upright, trying not to fall over. "Yes," he croaked in a pitiable tone. "Look at me. I'm done for. Bury me beneath the tree behind the stables. You're crushing me." I gasped as he shifted even more of his weight onto my upper body until I eventually pushed him off. He grinned. Okay, no more being dramatic? For real though, that was hell. A very special, personal kind of hell. My kin is obnoxious. Worse yet, get this. The old fart still hasn't died. He took off his ball cap and raked a hand through his hair before placing it back on top of his head. Very distressing. That is not what I came out there for. They made me eat with them. Carrie, at the same table and everything. And even with her husband literally about to die. My aunt has the nerve to give everyone a dinner wine but myself. And do you know what she said? She said she wanted to avoid any further tragedies. So no drinks for me. In this, really haughty tone as well. I had half a mind to leave right then and there. Well, to be frank, you do get a bit weird when you're drunk, I remarked, looking up at the ceiling as the many times I'd seen him naked on the roof or on top of his barn came back to me. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it. Oh, so you're on her side? You haven't even met the woman. She's terrible. Besides, I only came to see my Uncle Croat. Not to get lectured. How's he doing, by the way? Much better, Ben growled, his voice both carrying disappointment and contempt, as he trudged on past me and flung himself onto his couch. I took a seat beside him and looked at him, waiting for his face to soften. I know how to read a room, and it's always best to talk to Ben when he isn't pissed already. Granted, it doesn't take him long to calm down at all. If he gets angry at you, he'll stomp around and huff for a moment. But if you don't provoke him further, he'll be right back to normal. You just have to give him 10 seconds to cool off, and after that, he's as good as new. Finally, Ben's shoulders dropped and his narrowed eyes widened again as the frown on his face faded away. He gave me a slight smile, and I moved a bit closer to him, pulling my feet up on the sofa and turning over to him so we could talk. So how was it? He gave a dismissive wave of his hand, like watching paint dry out. Nothing much happened at all. All my other aunts and uncles were there with their kids. Not really kids though, most of them are either grown up or in their teens. So I had a lovely evening listening to a bunch of dumb wisecracks. Absolutely insufferable. Why don't you like your relatives? Why don't they like me? That's the real question here. Believe me, I've tried it the nice way. But they never give me a break. They make me out to be this black sheep. Something between a total clown they can laugh at and a dangerous criminal to tell scary stories about. He rolled his eyes but avoided my gaze. Kind of like he was worried I'd agree with them and he'd see it on my face. You're neither, I assured him. Not as far as I'm concerned at least. I cocked my head to the side. Sure, what you're doing is highly illegal, I hurriedly added, upon which Ben let out a soft sigh. But I don't think anybody you know ought to be scared of you. You're damn right. Well, I hope you really do think so. I did say some nasty stuff about my uncle. And yeah, sure I'd kinda not be sad if he'd bite the dust. But I'd never do any work on that front myself, if you catch my drift. I nodded eagerly. I didn't think you would. I said, I meant it. Good. He muttered. That's good. He paused, giving me a sidelong glance. He looked pensive, deep in thought. I could almost hear the question before he voiced it. In fact, for a moment I was even tempted to say it at the same time as him. Were you in the pink room? I was, I answered quietly. And I saw the bones. You did you? Ben's mouth was a stiff little line. What did you think? What did I think? I repeated blankly. That's some good-looking bones. My friend's nervousness broke out of him as a mirthless chuckle. Once he'd gotten himself together again, he let out a low groan before turning to face me again. The room doesn't belong to me, he told me in an empty, stern tone. But I suppose you already guessed that. I nodded quietly, hoping to encourage him to keep talking. It used to be my sister's. He swallowed. You didn't know it, but for the better part of my life, I did have a little sister. He slowly reached up to remove the faded red ball cap from his head and gently ran his fingers over the writing on it. He grinned and waved it at me. That's her impossible scrawl right here. Communism is just a red herring. That's a quote from a movie. Clue, I think it was called. She loved it, and that line came up in there a couple times. She thought it was hilarious. He shrugged. Never particularly cared for it. Personally. See, My sister was also the one who decorated the house. Literally all of it. She had an eye for these things. I offered a friendly smile as I looked around the room. I'd always thought it was nice in here. You kept it like that ever since? Of course. I'd never change a thing about this. It's all her. It is hers and she'd be livid. No doubt. Sure, she's not around at the moment. But still. Ben tipped his head back to look up at the ceiling. Her name is Pearl. That's a very pretty name. I think so too. I was the one to name her. Actually, when she was born, I was 8 years old already. He spoke in such a soft and regretful way that I nearly forgot I was talking to the same man who had gotten into a fistfight with one of his friends over a turkey race. He rarely allows his emotions to seep into his voice when talking, and hearing this really caught me off guard. What came next was even more startling. "Do you believe in things that aren't from this world?" he asked me, sounding almost dreamy. Like, there's us, there's humans, but do you think there's more? Such as ghosts? I offered, my mouth oddly dry. For example, do you? I don't really think about that kind of stuff. I confessed, crossing my arms nervously. I don't like it. Then I won't press on this matter. But what I'm getting from your reaction is that you're afraid of believing in it, so you choose not to. Is that right? He stared at me with a sudden, unfamiliar intensity. Maybe, I replied. It might be. To level with you. As it happens, these things do play a larger role in my life. I understand if you want no part of it. I won't bother you with the details if they'll end up frightening you. For the very first time, I didn't insist on an explanation. I'm a very comfortable person. I'm comfortable with my own life, my views, my beliefs, myself. And while I, as many people do, often feel like this and that could or should be improved, when it comes down to the essentials, I'm extremely happy with my outlook. The thing Ben was suggesting to share with me right then, however, was something that would have been able to utterly mess me up. In short, I hate being frightened. I don't even like to think about things that could frighten me. I push them all down until they're so far gone that there's no chance of them resurfacing. And that's how I keep myself free and unworried. But it was not to be. For one, I did regret my decision. It felt like I was distancing myself from Ben. Plus, I had tried for a long time to find out what he was all about, his need for money, his abducting of large animals, basically everything. And now that it all seemed to be coming to a head, I was too nervous to see this through. I was frankly ashamed of myself. I'd always thought my curiosity would prove stronger than that. It wasn't by choice that I eventually did get involved after all. Mind you, so this was 3 days later. It happened while I was at Ben's place. Because of course it did. There was a thunderstorm raging outside and the two of us were watching TV. Or at least we tried to as best we could. The weather caused quite a few disturbances. Still, we were having an alright time. Ben was drinking, as per usual in the late hours. But not enough to get tipsy or anything. He only gets hammered once a week. Namely on the night of Friday to Saturday morning. But I digress. There we were, sitting and either looking at the flickering screen or chatting to each other. When all of a sudden, a loud cry pierced the relative silence. I jumped in my seat, alarmed by the sheer volume of this ghastly noise. If the scream had in any way startled Ben, he wasn't letting it on. An eyebrow raised at my reaction. He took a sip of his beer. "Relax," he said casually. "That's just outside." "Oh, right. That explains it," I told him, hoping he'd detect the sarcasm in my unnerved tone. "It does, actually." He leaned back, tracing the rim of the can in his hand with his fingers. "If it's outside, it's none of our business. We're in here and it's out there and it can't bother us." It really sounded like somebody got hurt though. "If that's what you're worried about, I can safely assure you that it's not the case." "How do you know that?" "It's a thing. Remember the face in the window? It's like one of those things. It's not real. Write that down somewhere if you have to. Or do you want to go out and check?" "Maybe," I said, sensing a hint of sarcasm in his tone. "Oh ho," he replied, now barely containing his doubts anymore. "That would be the brave thing to do. Well, I can assure you you won't be hurt, but you will get wet and scared. And you're gonna come back none the wiser. But if that doesn't bother you, by all means, go ahead." I suddenly felt very insecure. But not the kind of insecure that makes you nervous, but the kind that makes you want to prove something. "Are you implying that I couldn't handle your weird house illusions?" "Implying?" I thought it was obvious. Now he sounded downright bitter. "You didn't even want to talk about them, or the reason they happened. So that's what this was about." He had told me he was all right not talking about it. But he wasn't. Now that I knew, there were 3 things I could do. I could bite my lip and shut the old trap. I could reason with him before this would turn into some kind of fight and we could handle things the normal way, like adults. Or I could walk my ass out there into the rain to prove that I wasn't a scaredy cat. 2 of these things ended with me finding out more than what I'd bargained for, and the third would be incredibly unpleasant on top of everything else. And yet it would make me look brave, which I was not. Still, for some reason, this was important to me. I should probably mention I'd had a bit of wine earlier, and that might have played a role in the making of said poor decision as well. But either way, I got up and strode over to the door, fully determined to go out there and face the storm and check if there was anybody calling for help. "What are you doing?" Ben asked, completely bewildered as he watched me stumble around trying to get my shoes on. I just huffed and gave him a cold shrug, to which he seemed to grow more alarmed. "Carrie, come on. I didn't mean anything by that." Carrie, no. But I had already made my way out the door, even as I heard Ben lumbering up to follow me, calling after me in a way similar to a dog owner trying to sway his wayward pet to come back. The raindrops hit my skin hard as they came down on me. It was that warm kind of summer rain. It wouldn't even have been unpleasant if it hadn't been for the strong wind and the thunder in the distance. Still, I heard the scream again, and it seemed to drown out everything else. I followed it blindly, rendered disoriented by the water whipping into my face. Before I knew it, I was standing in the small field behind Ben's house. The corn was standing pretty high already at that time of the year, looking down. I couldn't even see my feet anymore. Looking up, I found that the sky was of a dark, impenetrable gray. The scream rang out again, this time almost right beside me. It was so close to my ear that it hurt and I jumped, spinning around only to find myself face to face with a pale young woman. Her mouth was still open, even though her scream had died down. It took me a moment to register the basics of her appearance. She had dirty blonde, almost brown hair, large blue eyes, Her lips, though chapped and dry-looking, were full and heart-shaped, and despite her hollow cheeks and exhausted appearance, one could see youth and grace in her features. There was something strange about her though, something that put me off. At first I couldn't put my finger on it, but then I realized it. I had seen her before, on the very first day that I'd spent at Ben's place, or the night following it rather. She was the girl from the window. My stomach dropped as I stared at her. Mouth agape. She looked back at me with those same blue eyes. There was something weirdly dull in their glare. I couldn't look away from them, until her mouth tore out of its rigidity and she began to speak. Her voice wasn't like I remembered. It was sharp and grating, like someone was pouring dozens of tiny pebbles down my ear canal. I winced at the sound of it, recoiling like a hurt animal. "You're not him," she growled. "Where is he? Where is he?" I shook my head, speechless as I started looking around for Ben. The wind had suddenly grown stronger, like it was trying to knock me off my feet. I couldn't see clearly anymore. Panicking, I staggered backwards, trying to get some distance between me and that woman. But to no avail. She stepped forward, her tiny fists clenched and her chin pressed out. "Tell him it's no use," she shouted. "Tell him I'm dead," as I stared into the dark red hole that was her gaping mouth. I noticed something wriggling somewhere in there. For a few seconds, I couldn't see what it was, but I watched it worm its way forth onto her tongue, until it emerged from her lips. It was worms. Pale, thick worms. Perhaps maggots. And they pulled themselves out from the depths of her throat. The woman began to retch, and with a stifled gurgle, she spit them out onto the ground before starting to scream again. Her eyes squeezed shut. She howled like a wild animal. I was horrified. I felt cold sweat mixing with the rain that dripped down my face. I stood and stared, almost too afraid to move, until suddenly, I felt warm fingers firmly wrap themselves around my wrist. I turned to see Ben, towering above me, pulling me back into the direction of the house. I followed gratefully, eventually collapsing onto the dry floor covered by carpet, the heated air of my friend's comfortable home enveloping me. I heard him slam the door behind us. He didn't comment on my poor, drunken decision to run out into the fields. Instead, he took his shoes off and went upstairs to return with a bunch of towels. It took me a while to calm down, and even longer to get dry and warm again. All things considered though, I caught myself rather quickly. And when I did, I knew that by having done what I just did, having seen what I'd just seen, I'd crossed a line. It didn't matter what I'd believed in before. I would never be able to look at things the way I'd used to again. So now, my half-assed measures to protect whatever peace of mind I had left didn't matter anymore. Now, Ben could just as well tell me everything. It's not a good idea to ask someone like Ben to pick you up from the airport, or to do anything else that could result in him pulling a fast one on you for that matter. A couple years back, my uncle and I took a trip to Spain. It was about 5 to 10 months after my aunt had died and he was still recovering from the loss. With little success, mind you. I suggested the trip to him as a way of finding some comfort and relaxation. And it worked. He was having a really great time, which obviously delighted me. During our stay, however, I got a call from a friend of mine who needed my help with something important. I don't remember what it was, but it warranted a change of plans and I had to go home early because of it. My uncle was doing pretty well on his own, and he assured me he'd be just fine. So I packed up my things and got ready to board the plane. I had asked Ben to pick me up from the airport at home and he promised he'd be there. Ever the gentleman. And he was. He stood right there by the gate, holding up an enormous sign with the words "Welcome Mail Order Bride" written on it in huge pink letters. My first instinct was to turn and get back on the plane. To be honest, what made it worse was that as soon as I had shamefully trudged up to him, he threw his arm around my waist and said in a voice loud enough for everyone around us to hear, "You're gonna love it here, baby." I'm saying this because it's the sort of thing I like reminiscing about. But also to show you what kind of guy Ben is. He likes practical jokes, especially when they're at the expense of people who are too emotionally attached to him to stay mad for a long time. Considering what he told me happened to him in the past though, it's astounding that he retained any sense of humor at all. I don't know if I would have been able to. At least not all on my own. Ben never got any help, neither professional nor from friends and family. He once explained to me that while he was acquainted with a lot of people, there was hardly anyone he was really close to. He doesn't like talking about his emotions to anyone. It's a miracle he felt comfortable enough to share some of them with me. He told me everything right after I saw the lady in the field. I was sitting on his sofa wrapped up in a blanket, still shivering from the chilly rain. I was almost certain I'd caught a cold already. Ben looked completely unfazed, physically at least. I could see he was uneasy. His left eye was twitching slightly and he kept pulling on his lower lip. The way he was pacing to and fro in the living room was enough to make me nervous as well. But I didn't dare to say anything in fear of making him shut down again. "I didn't think you'd go outside," he finally said, breathing a deep sigh. "I don't know why I did it," I replied sheepishly. "I'm sorry. I was being stupid. And a bit tipsy." No, it's fine. I mean, yeah, you were being stupid as hell. But that's okay." He sat down beside me, the couch uttering a pained creak as he did. He was facing away from me, looking straight ahead at the dark, silent TV. "So I suppose you've already had some ideas about the girl." I nodded quietly. I admitted. "It doesn't make sense to me, but I feel like, I took a deep breath. "That was your sister, wasn't it?" "Yes and no. First off, what you saw out there was not actually Pearl. Just something that looked like her. Or tried to look like her. In case you remember the face in the window you saw the first time you stayed here. That was the same thing." "Oh, I remember. Yeah, well, it's hard to explain. It's a whole weird-ass mess. Even I think it's difficult to understand. You're gonna have to be a little patient with me." So he told me the whole story. I'll recount it in third person since I don't want this to turn out any more confusing than it already is. It began with Ben as a young boy. He and his parents were already living at the same farmhouse, though it looked a lot different back then. He remembered that it was sparsely decorated and in general a rather gloomy and ramshackle place. Ben's mother and father weren't on the best of terms. According to him, it was doubtful they were ever truly in love, and all he ever saw them do was fight. When he was very little, it used to disturb him. But after a while it stopped and he became strangely attuned to it. He simply didn't care anymore. Ben was not the most obedient child, having been way ahead of his age in terms of size and strength. He towered above most other students at his elementary school, which for them was quite unfortunate seeing as Ben turned out to be a bit of a bully. Knowing him as a grown-up, that last part is a little hard to imagine for me. Then again, it wasn't hard to see where all his anger was coming from. Ben said himself that he suspected he took the pent-up frustration from home to school with him and unleashed it upon anybody who dared to come into an arm's reach of him. Needless to say, he often got into a lot of trouble. His teachers described his aggressive behavior as severe and unprovoked. However, things began to change when his mother gave birth to a baby girl. Getting a little sister had been the last thing on Ben's mind. It came completely unexpected, and it baffles him to this day, to his knowledge. His parents hardly ever did so much as hug or kiss, let alone do either of these things with no clothes on. Surprising as it was, he welcomed this change in his family's life, and he loved the little girl from the very start. Finding his enthusiasm sweet, Ben's mother asked if he had any suggestions for a baby name. To her surprise, he immediately had an idea at the ready, almost like he'd given the matter some thought before. So that's how they ended up calling her Pearl. Ben adored Pearl. He liked his role as the big brother, and the sheer existence of his new siblings seemed to take away from his temper. His short fuse turned into an air of repose. It was an excited, jumpy sort of calm, but it was calm nonetheless. He learned to compose himself for her sake. He felt that he needed to protect her, and in doing so, he'd need to become a little more like an adult. Still, he retained parts of his rougher personality. And that might just have been how all the madness that would come down on his home and family took root in the first place. One summer afternoon, he was playing in the garden by himself. Pearl was still just a baby, so she was not outside with him at the time. He had a big plastic toy truck which he pushed around on the grass almost listlessly. He was deep in thought when suddenly, he noticed that there was someone standing beside him. It was a man with dark hair and freckled skin, and he'd appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Little Ben hadn't even heard him walk up or come in through the garden gate. And yet, there he was. "That's a nice thingy you have there. What is it, a car?" the man asked with interest, a bit taken aback but feeling it necessary to respond in some way. Ben nodded his head yes. "I have a little son too. You know, he's younger than you though, I'd say." The man carried on. "How old are you, little man?" Ben was a bit frightened at that point, and certainly very suspicious. After all, there was a total stranger standing in the garden with him, seemingly having grown straight out of the ground, seemingly trying to make conversation with him. His parents may have had their differences and shortcomings, but they hadn't neglected to warn their son of weird grown-up people who could approach him unexpectedly and chat him up. He knew nothing good could ever come of that, which was why he decided that there was no need for politeness or any other show of obedience in this situation. "What's it to you?" he replied with all the sharpness a preteen kid could muster. The man's look almost instantly changed into one of strong disapproval. He glared at the young boy like he'd just kicked him in the shin. "That's not a nice tone there, young man," he said. "What's it to you?" Ben repeated, hoping to convey that he didn't feel he owed this creep any sort of niceties. The stranger got the point all right. His frown deepened and his mouth opened slightly, releasing a powerful exhale that came out as something of a hiss. He soon regained his composure though, straightened up and forced something of a smile onto his face. "My son doesn't have any toys at all," he told him. "He'd like this. Would you give it up for him?" No. Ben didn't think he'd need to elaborate on that. He'd be really happy though. "I'd be happy if you'd leave. Tell you what, give me your toy and I'm good as gone." "No," Ben repeated, more firmly this time, looking over at the house. He found that, to his dismay, neither his mother nor father were anywhere near or even standing at a window to watch him from inside. He'd have to take care of this himself. So he thought, and he employed a verbal weapon to do so. He'd heard his father swear before. That always seemed to get the point across. "Fuck off." The man recoiled, looking beyond insulted. "Aren't you a disgusting little shit?" he muttered, apparently feeling it necessary to respond in kind. "If you don't get the hell out of here, I'm gonna scream for my dad," Ben said flatly, staring up at the stranger with stern resolution before turning back to the toy car. Deciding to simply ignore him until he'd leave. He couldn't stand it for very long though, and his curiosity forced him to turn and check after just a few seconds. The stranger was gone. He wasn't walking off or anything. It was like he'd simply disappeared. Ben was a relatively reckless child. He never liked telling his parents about basically anything. It wasn't as though he had much of an opportunity to do so anyway, seeing as they were mostly busy fighting all the time. This had gone so far that Ben had even developed a sort of distaste for them. He felt neither love nor trust for either of them. They weren't exactly a comforting presence, and he preferred being apart from them. His true link to the family was and had always been his sister. Even though she was still a baby at the time, he would have told her about his encounter with the weird man if she'd been able to understand him talking to her. But seeing as she wasn't, he decided to keep it to himself entirely. That wasn't the last he'd see of him though. The very same night, he was lying in his bed, as per usual still awake even though it was way past midnight. Ben used to have a lot of trouble sleeping as a kid. Restless nights were a common occurrence. He'd found that it was best to simply shut his eyes and breathe steadily. Pretending to be asleep would quite often lead to the real thing. His toy truck was standing atop the desk in the corner of his room, right below the window. The curtains weren't drawn, allowing the young boy to look outside at the dark sky. The night started off uneventfully. All was silent, his blanket wrapped tightly around him. Ben's eyelids grew heavier and heavier. He welcomed the calm, almost ready to give himself over to it, but not quite shutting his eyes just yet. That was when, even though he could hardly see anymore at all, he spotted something at the window. Movement. His eyes fluttered open, but he didn't sit up. There looked to be nothing there. The night sky behind the glass pane remained unchanged. At first, he thought he had simply seen a bird or a bat pass by the side of the house, and he was confident enough in this explanation. Once more, he closed his eyes, only to be startled again by a quiet, high-pitched squeaking noise. It sounded kind of like someone rubbing at glass. Carefully opening his eyes, he now became aware of a dark spot outside, visible down at the very bottom of the window. It somehow stood out against the rest of the darkness that was to be seen there. Something wasn't right about it. Deciding to observe the situation the stealthy way, he rested his head on his pillow once more and proceeded to shut his eyes halfway so he could still watch the window while outwardly appearing to be asleep. This was a difficult feat, seeing as it took a while until anything else happened and Ben had to be very careful to not actually drift off to sleep. Then suddenly, just as he had been about to give up and call it a night, he saw the dark spot rising up from its position at the bottom of the window. As it rose, its outline became clearer too, and Ben could finally tell what it was he'd been looking at, a head of hair. And attached to said hair was a familiar face. Even in the darkness, he recognized it. It was the same man who'd accosted him in the garden earlier. Peeking in through the window with an indiscernible look in his eyes, Ben could feel his heart begin to race. He was terrified, even though he tried not to show it. After all, he wasn't planning on letting on that he was awake at all. Unlike what a lot of other kids might have done, his first instinct was not to shout out to his parents. In fact, the thought that he could have possibly called upon them for help only occurred to him much later. His head was weirdly empty as he lay there, frozen in fear, watching the man outside with hooded eyes. For a few moments, he seemed to just be standing there, remaining still as a statue right outside the window. The only thing about him that moved being the wind blowing aside strands of his hair. Then a tiny little clicking noise was to be heard. The man's face was still in the window, but Ben could see that he'd reached up his hand and was now fumbling around with the outside window frame. The young boy didn't have the faintest idea how the stranger had done it. But after a few more clicks and unnerving scratching noises, the window swung open with a drawn-out creak. Ben couldn't even fathom it at first. He felt it before he even saw it. The cold draft of nightly air grazing the side of his face and tousling his locks. Next, his eyes registered that there now was an opening, that the window had given way, that the stranger now had access to the house, to his room. He fully expected him to go on and squeeze his whole ghastly frame through the window and climb inside. And in anticipation of exactly that, he pressed his eyes shut. Still, he didn't scream for help. Maybe it was because he feared that that would only make the man come in faster and snatch him. Or maybe it was because he hoped it was all a dream. Perhaps he'd even given up on all chances of a rescue already and simply wanted to spare himself the sight of what was sure to be his kidnapper. So he lay there, terrified, pulse racing, eyes closed, and waited. Only nothing happened. He dared to open his eyes just in time to see a pale hand withdrawing, pulling the window shut behind itself. He stayed still for just a moment longer, staring in fading shock at the window. Once he was certain the man had truly left, he sat up to scan the room. At first glance, nothing appeared to be amiss until he noticed that his toy truck, which had been parked right beneath the window, was gone. Ben didn't feel like getting up. Instead, he resorted to a pastime he used to employ quite often back in the day. He pulled his blanket over his head, making sure not a single limb was sticking out, curled up underneath it and wept. In the morning, the light of day revealed that in the place of the truck, a flat stone had been left. Oddly enough, there was a message carved into it. "Little Benjamin is a rotten boy." That was the first of many encounters with the man, and others like him. and they would ultimately end up shaping Ben's life into what it is now. I'll need another drink for this. After Ben had told me that first portion of his story, I knew what would follow would be equally unpleasant. I'd curled up in the corner of his sofa, staring at him with wide eyes. He didn't seem to like that, as he made it a point not to look at me directly. But I couldn't help it. Eventually, he told me to either close my eyes or turn my head, because according to him, I looked a lot like a seal at the moment and it was putting him out. Then he gave the aforementioned statement about needing another drink and headed over to the kitchen. I used this moment to compose myself. This was a lot to take in. When Ben came back, I tried to smile at him, but I think he could see that I was on edge. To my surprise, this seemed to please him and he gave me a sympathetic nod. I know this isn't a nice story. I'm actually kind of glad you're not sitting here grinning or laughing or whatever. I'm sorry to creep you out, but at least you seem to believe me. I do, I confirmed, sitting up a little taller. That's a great comfort. I wasn't sure, he said, plopping down beside me once more. He offered me one of the 2 cans of beer he'd brought, but I declined with a wave of my hand. It'd be easy enough to chalk it up to me being soft in the head. He went on, I suppose I am. Maybe a little bit, you know? But who isn't? Who wouldn't be? I offered. Exactly. And I know you're unnerved by all this, but you're taking it seriously. I appreciate that. He cleared his throat. This is a bit weird, but could you sit a little closer? I'd feel more. I don't know. I simply nodded and crawled up to his side, settling down again with my shoulder pressing up against his arm. Better? I asked. He took a deep breath. Yeah, thanks. Sorry for being so jumpy. Can I go on? I swallowed. Please do. So he did. Ben had spent his entire life in that same old house, seeing as the farm was providing for them. The idea of moving had never really been on the table for his mother and father. That was of course understandable. But for Ben, it was pretty unfortunate. He'd meekly suggested changing places to them after the nighttime encounter he'd had with the man in the garden. But they'd turned down the thought immediately. Ben liked to tell himself that if he'd explained to them why he suddenly didn't feel all that comfortable in his own home anymore, they wouldn't have wasted any time in packing their bags and setting up somewhere else. But he was almost certain that was not the case. They'd either end up calling him crazy or, on the off chance that they would believe him, simply resolve to be more vigilant in the future and call it a day. Sure, he had the stone with the eerie message carved into it, so maybe that would have counted as evidence. But ultimately, he kept it to himself. Perhaps it was also because he wanted to avoid talking to his parents at length regarding it. He really didn't have much faith in their willingness to make him feel better. It wouldn't be worth the effort, he told himself. On top of that, there was the lingering threat of the stranger figuring out he'd exposed him and deciding to get back at him. He spent the next couple months in fear, constantly on alert and always looking over his shoulder. At nighttime, he would experience the worst feelings of trepidation of all. He couldn't sleep with his back turned to the window anymore. He needed to see it at all times. He'd watch it, his eyes wide open even when his lids would grow increasingly heavy. Even when he was so tired that he couldn't even lift his head up anymore. He was too scared to go to sleep, scared of the man's face appearing outside again like it had that first night. Eventually, he'd simply fall unconscious as he was unable to fight his fatigue. Needless to say, it was hellish. Thankfully, his fears slowly faded away as time went on. Nothing else happened for years. And Ben was more than grateful for that. He was about ready to chalk the whole incident up to a one-time thing. Meanwhile, the household situation had become a little more strained. Pearl was 8 years old when Ben's mother left. The day before it happened, the siblings' parents had had a terrible fight. A violent fight, in response to which the mother took both kids out to go shopping. Instead of going into the store though, they remained seated in the car. 16-year-old Ben in the passenger seat while Pearl was stirring uncomfortably in the back. The boy gave his mother a sidelong glance as she sat there, her shoulders shaken by quiet sobs which she apparently attempted to stifle. He reached back to press his sister's hand, feeling a bit relieved as tiny fingers curled around his. Pearl drew comfort from his presence. He knew so, and that was what comforted him. The mother wiped her tears away, sniffing loudly as she turned to face her daughter. "I'm sorry you had to see me cry like this, sweetie," she said softly, her voice faltering and cracked. "You should never have to see Mommy cry. And you shouldn't ever cry yourself. You ought to smile, sweetie. Always smile." She was gone the very next day. Her daughter didn't take her lesson to heart. Pearl cried a lot when she realized her mother wouldn't be coming back. Ben tried to comfort her as best he could, but it was a difficult time for either of them. He was sad too, but not as much as he felt he needed to be. In fact, he was feeling oddly disconnected from the entire thing. To him, it was worse that his father's way of coping appeared to be throwing temper tantrums and smashing glass bottles, plates and cups, breaking just about everything in the house. For 5 more years, Ben and Pearl had to endure his screaming and weeping and the seemingly endless tirades about his wife he'd shout in slurred speech. It all stopped when one night, he drunkenly climbed on top of his barn and threw himself off it. It was Ben who found his father's body in the morning. He didn't scream. He didn't wince. He didn't shed a single tear. Not even as time went on. He simply turned around, went back inside and called the police. An ambulance wouldn't be necessary. He didn't bother waking up his sister. It had only upset her and he figured she might take the shock better if he didn't fling it right at her after ripping her out of a good night's sleep. Seeing as he was up already, he decided to simply start working. His father had introduced him to farm work. He'd showed him everything he needed to know, and they'd done it side by side. There had never been much of a bond between the father and son. But when Ben went to look after the pigs that day, he caught himself chatting away to the air beside him, pretending like his father was there, looking over his shoulder. "Am I doing this right, Daddy? No, don't worry. I've got everything under control here. I've got this. Sure, Pearl's gonna miss you, I guess. Of course I'll keep sending her to school. She's gonna be a doctor or something someday. Don't you think? So you got really drunk last night. I heard you. You know, I heard you go outside. I was in bed though. Are you mad I didn't go after you? I'm curious. Did you jump or did you fall? If you fell, congrats. That was really dumb. If you jumped, you're an asshole. I mean, why in the world would you do that to Pearl? You made an orphan of your daughter. No, of course I still love you. Dad, I'm just mad at you right now. From there on out, it was Ben who took care of his little sister. He was all on his own with her, and they were off to a rough start. The first thing he did was call up his uncle, his father's brother. He'd already heard of the accident and assured Ben he was deeply sorry for it. When Ben asked whether he would come over for a little while, however, he declined. "Are you sure? I'm worried about Pearl. I think if she'd see her little cousins for a day or so it'd help her a lot." Ben prodded hopefully. "No can do, son. We've been busy as hell over here." Ben gritted his teeth at the tone of his relative's voice. He sounded almost casual. "Busy how? You know, this and that stuff comes up. Are you at least gonna attend the funeral? I'll see what we can do." They didn't come. Ben ended up standing by the grave alone, holding his sister, the crying girl pressing herself to him. Some of his father's friends and workers had shown up, but not a trace of the family. This marked the start of a deep grudge against his aunt and uncle, but also the birth of the realization that he was Pearl's only guardian. It was a lot of responsibility, but he didn't mind it. In a way, it made him happy to know that she was relying on him. He felt needed and appreciated, and he did his best to show her that she was in no way a burden. Pearl was heartbroken after the death of her father, but to Ben's surprise, she caught herself fairly quickly. Both siblings soon got used to the way it was now, and as cruel as it made him feel to admit it, Ben almost liked these new circumstances a little better. The house was always quiet now. Nobody was cursing or yelling anymore. He started fixing up the place, beginning with a couple loose floorboards, then the small hole in the roof, then the old, crooked fence in the garden. He brushed off the marks the neglect of the once beautiful building had left on it and turned into an elegant, well put together house once again. Pearl was incredibly enthusiastic about the changes her brother was making. One day when he'd picked her up from school and they were walking up the hill back home, she mentioned how the house looked so proud now. Ben laughed and asked her what she meant by that. "Before you started renovating, it looked kind of ashamed of itself, especially with all the other pretty houses around it. It looks so much more confident now," she explained to him, dead serious. "Well, as long as it doesn't think it's too good for us," Ben replied, chuckling and shaking his head. Pearl was a clever kid. She had a lot of imagination, but she wasn't moony or dreamy. She did extremely well in school, and at the end of term, she emerged top of her class. Ben would often call her a nerd in a joking, loving way. He was glad he didn't need to help her with her homework. His school days had been nothing to write home about. Still, he encouraged her as best he could, and she lapped up his praise like a bloodhound. For every flawless report card that came in, he bought her presents or took her on trips to reward the achievement. He let her decorate the inside of the house, happy that she took joy in prettying everything up. The farm was bringing in enough money for the two of them to live comfortably, if he'd make a few concessions. So Ben figured he'd even be able to send her to med school one day. It was what Pearl wanted, and he'd do anything for her. But as her school years were slowly approaching their end, something changed within her. The first incident happened on the night of her 18th birthday. She was up before her brother, a rarity in itself, seeing as Ben always woke up before the first rays of sunlight made their way into the windows. Therefore, he was very surprised to find her sitting at his bedside. shaking him by the shoulders to bring him out of his unconscious state. His eyes fluttered open and he rubbed his face as he groggily sat up in bed. "What's going on?" he murmured. "There's a man outside," Pearl whispered. Her bright eyes darted around the room nervously, almost as if she expected someone to jump out from under the bed or inside the closet. I was excited. I couldn't really sleep. I kept waking up. Then I looked out the window and there was a man on a horse out in the field. He was riding up to the house and then the horse jumped the fence and now he's in our garden. He's just standing there. He's been there for like 10 minutes already. I think he saw me in the window. Even in Ben's foggy, clouded mind that sounded absurd. "Are you sure that wasn't a dream?" he suggested, stifling a chuckle. "Yes," she insisted. "Come look if you don't believe me." And before he could respond, she'd already grabbed him by the arm and begun pulling him to his feet. She dragged her older brother into the living room, where she crouched down in front of one of the windows facing the garden. "Look," she repeated, her voice little more than a nervous whisper. She was right. The shadowy silhouette of a man was distinctly visible by the fence, next to that of an enormous horse. Ben swallowed and cleared his throat. He rubbed his eyes a few times, blinking and looking up again. But the two figures remained. "Okay, yeah, they're real all right," he told his sister, and she hummed in agreement. "So what now? They're freaking me out. We can't just let them stay there, right?" "No," Ben confirmed, feeling nervousness and anxiety rise up in his gut. He didn't show it though. For Pearl's sake. Can't have that. "So what do we do?" "You stay right here and keep your eyes open. If something goes wrong, call the police. I'm going outside," her brother replied, his tone calm and unwavering. He started looking around for something to take outside with him until deciding that his father's old hunting rifle would do. After removing it from the locked cabinet it had been inhabiting for what must have been the last century, he quickly got it loaded and made his way outside. He had barely taken the time to slip into his boots. So there he was now, wearing only shorts and a t-shirt. Trudging up to the fence the stranger was leaning against. The cold early morning air chilled him to the bone, but it was easy enough to ignore in the light of the situation. The first thing he heard of the man was his whistling. The tune on the stranger's lips carried softly through the garden. Strangely enough, it sounded quite nice in an eerie, ghostly way, but Ben wasn't going to stop and listen to it. His knees were weak already, and they grew even more wobbly the closer he got. The horse let out a soft snort upon noticing the young man approaching. It was larger than any other animal of its kind he'd ever seen before, and almost completely black. Its rider stood beside it unmoving, not reacting to Ben's presence in any way until he eventually called out to him. "Hey, over there." The whistling stopped. The figure pushed off from the fence and took a few steps into Ben's direction. Both men stopped just a few feet apart from one another. In the darkness, Ben couldn't really make out much of the stranger's face, except that it gave off a strange air of familiarity he didn't like. Something about his dark hair and all the freckles covering his face made it feel like they'd met before. "Little Benjamin, look at you, all grown up." The voice cut through the mist, veiling Ben's memory like a knife. His grip on the gun tightened as his heart dropped into his stomach. He remembered now. He remembered that voice, that face, Those hands that had reached into his window. A chill ran down his spine, his skin crawling as he tried to steel himself. It's been almost 20 years. Benjamin, the stranger went on, a knowing smile playing on his thin lips. But I had a feeling I'd left a lasting impression. Ben raised the gun slightly, steadying it with his other hand, afraid of dropping it because of how much his fingers were shaking. His palms were wet with cold sweat, making him fear the weapon would slip away from him. He studied the man's features. He didn't look old at all. In fact, he'd hardly changed from the last time he'd seen him. How was that even possible? After all, it really had almost been 2 decades. Realizing that you're standing in front of something that isn't human is, according to Ben, one of the most uncomfortable sensations to experience. It takes 3 stages, all of which Ben went through within only a few seconds that night. First, the acknowledgement of the strangeness itself, which expresses itself in an unsettling feeling that makes the whole body shudder. Then the deepening of said suspicion, and then finally the admission that one is facing a situation defying the comforts of logic. Ben was left standing there in his garden, frozen to the spot, eyes wide and unblinking, utterly disturbed. I take it you're not pleased to see me, with you holding that gun and all. What were you expecting? Ben asked, trying not to allow his voice to quiver. His heart was beating so loudly he was worried the stranger would hear it. What do you want? I was just wondering if last time the lesson I taught you about sharing hit home. The man's smile grew wider. I know you were awake. By the way, I know you saw me that night. He nodded at the rifle. Put that away, please. My dear boy, if I wanted to hurt you, I would have done so already. That plaything of yours wouldn't do much to stop me. Ben believed him. He was telling the truth. He could see it in his eyes. Ben lowered his weapon just a little bit. What the fuck are you? He hissed. The man tilted his head to the side. One should think your boyish curiosity would have shown during your childhood more than it does now. Did you ever wonder about me back then at all? Sure, you were scared of me. But you never did anything to find out what exactly happened that night or what became of your toy truck. I find that a bit strange. Stop rambling. Ben growled. What do you want? Why did you come here? The man sighed and looked up at the night sky in an almost dreamy fashion. Let me put it this way. I took your toy car for my little son back then. He liked it a lot. In fact, he was overjoyed. That made me very, very happy. I'm sure you know what it's like when there's someone you would do absolutely anything for. You stop at nothing. I miss those days when he was just a toddler, losing his mind over a bit of plastic. I have 2 daughters as well, by the way. Life's stressful with all of them clinging to me. Let me tell you. Well, thankfully, for once they all agree on one thing. Here he paused, looking at Ben with a raised eyebrow. And what would that be? Your sister looks really nice. This sent Ben over the edge. If there was one thing he was afraid of, it was something happening to Pearl. Leave her out of this. He snapped, the fear in his voice most likely audible. There was too much of it to remain hidden. You wanted to know why I'm here. She's why. Listen here. I don't know what the fuck you're on about. But if you think I'll let her get into arm's reach of you, I'll gut you like a pig. Ben hurled these words at the stranger, pressing them out from behind gritted teeth. If the rifle won't off you, I swear to God I'll find something that will. I'm inclined to believe you'd try." The man gave him an almost gentle smile. With that, he swung himself up onto his horse with no difficulty whatsoever, pressed his heels to its side and practically raced it over the fence, back into the field and into the direction of the woods behind it. Without thinking twice, Ben raised the rifle, took aim and fired a shot at the retreating man. But it didn't yield any results. Whether it was because he'd missed or because bullets really did leave the stranger unfazed, he didn't know. I should probably preface this by reminding you that Ben recounted this entire story to me within the span of just one night. Of course, what I'm posting here is a slightly condensed version. When he told me everything, there were a lot more pauses involved, a lot of fumbling for words, a lot of breaks to compose himself, and during certain parts a little crying as well. He tried to avoid the latter, quickly wiping his tears away as soon as they appeared, stifling his sobs and forcing his hands and shoulders to stay still. I noticed it right away. I didn't want him to feel any more pressured or stressed. He already was both of those things. And stopping himself from crying only contributed to this tension. The next time he raised his fingers to his face to keep his tears from reaching his cheeks. I carefully placed my hand on his arm and gently guided it back down. Ben only looked at me for a few moments without saying anything. Then he let out a soft, trembling sigh, shaking his head as he averted his eyes. "I don't like it when people see me bawl," he said, clearing his throat. "Not even you. Sorry. Why does it bother you? You know me," I reminded him, keeping my voice low and mild. "Doesn't it hurt to keep your eyes dry? Whenever I try to force back tears, it feels like something's pushing against my eyes from all sides. Isn't it uncomfortable?" "It is. Very much so. Actually." He tipped back his head and let out a little groan. "I don't know why it's bothering me. I really don't know. It shouldn't. But when I do cry, especially in front of others, it's like I'm not sure. This probably sounds crazy, but it's like I'm admitting something I don't want to admit. I understand, I think. Either way, it's not crazy. It's unnecessary." "It's not unnecessary either. Agree to disagree. I'd best go on." The night that Ben met the dark-haired man again marked a change in his and his sister's life. Mostly his sister's. Pearl had been watching the entire encounter go by from the window. When Ben came back inside, he tried not to show how shaken he was. He shut the door with shaking hands, locking it behind him before sinking backwards against it with a quivering sigh. "What's wrong?" Pearl asked, nervously staggering up to him. I don't get it. Who was that? What just happened?" "I'm not sure," he confessed, going over the encounter he just had in his mind. He tried to get a grip on himself and sort out the details. "We might have a problem." That was all he really knew, and all he could tell her at the moment. Once he'd finally collected his scattered thoughts, he told her everything, starting from the first time that he'd met the strange man. How frightened he'd been of him as a child and how he was dreading that he could do something to her after what he'd said. Pearl's reaction, however, was not what he'd expected it to be. Of course, she didn't believe it all at first, or rather she did believe it. Seeing as it was her brother whom she'd relied on and trusted all her life, she was hearing it from. But it was difficult to fathom. It would have been for anyone. But what followed wasn't the fear and concern Ben had braced himself for. Pearl's eyes had grown very wide, almost looking like two blue saucers. And there was a strange twinkle within them. "That's incredible," she breathed, her voice odd and almost adoring. This is crazy. I can't believe you never said anything before. We've got to write this down somewhere or something." Like, wow, you realize we're in danger, right? Ben asked sharply, a bit taken aback. Whatever these fuckers are, they're up to no good. And this creep, he asked for you. Like, specifically you. I don't want to scare you, but we're gonna have to watch out for you very carefully from now on. I think. She waved a careless hand at him, like she hadn't listened at all. What do you think he could be? If he was a spirit, oh. Just to say that out loud. She gave a tiny, gleeful giggle. This is so insane. I can't even, we need to look into this. What do you mean? Her brother inquired cautiously. Well, we've got to find out what that man is. You said he can't possibly be a normal person. This is exciting, right? Ben swallowed. I don't think so, he said slowly. This doesn't excite me. It freaks me out. Who cares what he is? We need to keep you away from him. That's all that matters. I know. But think about it. How many people are there who ever get to witness an entity like that? Something that's not human. A spirit. Maybe. This is incredible. It could be like our shot. At what? Getting killed? At finding out about something that can't be explained by, well, rationality, science. Ben shook his head, not knowing whether to laugh or get angry at her. That has to be the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Since when do you even say stupid things? Hell, since when don't like science anymore? I thought you and science were best friends. Don't you think it's at least a little intriguing? Pearl asked. Ben's shoulders sagged as he let out a small groan. You can think of this whatever you'd like. But I'm worried you're not realizing that this might be a threat. Please, could we just watch out for you? If something were to happen to you. I know. Her voice was soft and quiet, but something still told him she was simply brushing everything off. Having her agreement, more or less. At least. Ben started digging out what he hoped to be non-human repellents. He found a little wooden cross which he gave her to wear around her neck. An old leather bracelet with iron studs he used to wear in his late teens before realizing the hard rock, goth style wasn't a good look for him. And a tiny pouch he stuffed with salt and bay leaves. All these safety measures were founded on the limited research he'd conducted on the supernatural. Apparently, iron held off fairies. Bay leaves and salt were considered cleansing and spell warding, and he figured you could never go wrong with a cross. When he tried to stuff garlic into all of his sister's pockets, however, she finally gave a veto, saying that if he thought she'd be writing her finals covered in garnish, he'd be facing a whole new threat and it wouldn't be the man with the horse. She assured him she was seasoned to the extent a normal person could stand, and Ben admitted defeat. But not before making her promise not to go anywhere near the woods or the fields on her own. She'd simply rush in and out of the house for a while. Which was obviously not a long-term solution. But for the time being, it was the safest way to handle things. Ben was a bit worried it'd have some sort of emotional effect on her. But she assured him it was fine. She didn't seem to care much for the outside in general either way. What happened next is something Ben couldn't explain to himself for a very long time. He'd been so careful, and yet, something changed. Something about his sister changed. And he first noticed it when he woke up to a thumping noise in the middle of the night about a week later. It sounded like something heavy had been knocked over. He knew it had come from the living room. So despite still being in a bit of a haze, he hastily made his way out of bed and through the hallway. There, in the middle of the open space right next to the TV table, which now lay turned over at her feet, stood Pearl. She looked like she was half asleep, her legs shaking and unable to hold her upright steadily. Her head hung low and the eyes with which she looked up at him were glazed and milky. His heart dropped. He didn't know whether to feel relieved there was no intruder in the house or startled to see her there. Was she sleepwalking? Ben didn't know the first thing about sleepwalkers, and Pearl had never displayed that type of behavior before. But he remembered having heard somewhere that you weren't supposed to wake them up. He carefully stepped up to her, softly speaking her name but not receiving an answer. Up close, he noticed that her pajamas were crumpled and dirty, mud caking the bottom of her pants and even a tiny leaf tangled up in her collar. "Were you outside?" he uttered, more to himself than to her, surprised when she responded. "They called me," she whispered. "I had to follow them." The ghost of a smile flickered across her face and Ben couldn't help but wince. It was an eerie sight. "Father's calling again tomorrow," she added in the same hushed voice. "Father, Pearl, our father's dead," Ben muttered. "Remember? He fell off." "Not Dad," she interrupted him in that husky low murmur. "No, not Dad. The father." "What father?" Ben's stomach seemed to turn a little. "You know, the... She waved an absent-minded hand over her face, a gesture her brother didn't quite understand. It was only when she stammered out the word, "Freckles," that the realization set in. "Are you okay? What happened? Did they hurt you?" "No," she mumbled. "Nobody hurt me. I'm so happy." Her voice trailed off and that strange, eerie smile reappeared on her face. Ben guided her into her bedroom without another word, trying his best not to panic else he would disturb her. For the remainder of the night, he stayed awake outside her room, racking his brain to try and come up with a solution. All those little charms to ward off these strange people had failed the two of them. Of course they had. How was she to keep them on her person at all times anyway? That's when he had another idea. He laid out trails of salt with bits of garlic and bay leaves sprinkled in, placing them strategically outside all the doors and on the windowsills. He spread iron nails on them, one of which he drove into the wall above the front door, and from that he hung the wooden cross. He figured that this way, they wouldn't be able to contact her and lure her out while in this vulnerable state of unconsciousness. Once all of that was done, he laid back down, hoping to at least get one last wink of sleep before the sun would rise. At least that night, he rested assured that nothing else like this was going to happen. The morning after, Pearl couldn't remember a thing about what had happened. Or rather, that's what she claimed. Something about her manner and the way she seemed to hide little knowing smiles made her brother feel like she was lying to him. Still, he forced himself to stay calm. Nothing happened until a few nights later. Again, Benjamin was startled awake by a loud crashing noise. He tumbled out of bed and dragged himself out into the living room as fast as he could, only to stifle a scream, turning it into a sharp hiss upon finding Pearl standing there, She was swaying on her feet, looking down at a broken vase she had presumably swept off the dinner table by accident with a dazed smirk on her face. Glancing up at her brother with glassy eyes, she let out a high-pitched giggle. "Oops," she whispered. Ben couldn't help but hesitate before going up to her. He knew that was his sister right there. His baby sister who needed his help. And yet something about her just made him want to get as much distance between them as quickly as he could. Her dull yet for some reason piercing stare made his skin crawl. He couldn't bring himself to take a single step towards her. "Pearl?" he breathed, eyes glued to her smiling face. "Benji," she replied, adding another giggle. "You were outside again, weren't you?" She gave him an exaggerated nod, letting out a loud laugh that shook her entire body. He saw her knees give in beneath her and finally lurched forward, catching her and holding her up by the arms before she could fall. "The father called me," she argued in a low voice. "What was I supposed to do?" His voice was much weaker than before, but it still reached me. "Please don't do that again," Ben whispered, beginning to grow desperate as his mind raced. Pearl merely laughed quietly and rolled her shoulders against his hands. He heard a cracking noise coming from her back. Probably nothing out of the ordinary, but it made him jump nonetheless. "Pearl, can you hear me? Please. Please don't ever go outside again if he calls you." He felt tears forming in his eyes. He tried to push them back, but it was useless. Somehow he felt like he was losing her to something or someone he didn't understand. She didn't respond anymore. She just kept on smiling as he carefully guided her back into her room. Once she had stumbled over onto her bed, he shut the door behind himself, and it was all he could do not to collapse on the floor right then and there. He didn't know what to do. She was definitely out of her mind. He felt like she'd need to see a doctor or something. But for the time being, the most important thing was to keep her from sneaking out. He checked the outside of the front door. All the protective materials had been scattered all over the place. Like somebody, probably his sister, had wiped them off. The wooden cross had been snatched off the nail it had been hanging from and was lying in the dirt. They hadn't affected much in the first place, but knowing that she'd just gotten rid of them to assist these creatures made him feel just as helpless as before. Hoping against all hope that he could get some support from his family, he called his uncle, telling him that there was something going on with Pearl, that she was sick or something and that they needed help. He made up a bit of a lie there, but he'd tell them the absurd truth later. He was sure he'd conveyed the gist of it and how serious it was. But his uncle declined. No time, he'd said. Ben pleaded with him. He told him not everyone had to come, but that he really needed someone else to be there. Anyone. To no result. He fought the urge to smash the phone against the wall as he stiffly growled out some words of goodbye and hung up. The following days passed in a blur. Ben could hardly stop working, and though it wore him out, he didn't allow himself to fall asleep at night. He lay awake like a guard dog. Or at least he tried to. In the end, he never managed to stay up for as long as he'd hoped to. He laid out all the protective barriers again, despite them having proved useless. He tried locking Pearl in, a last resort which he hadn't wanted to use, only to find that she somehow managed to climb out the window. She was like a stage magician or an escape artist, always managing to get out of every room she was in. Then eventually there came a morning on which she simply didn't come back. Ben had fought his fatigue as best he could but had succumbed to sleep in the early hours of that same day. And while he'd usually find his sister somewhere around the house whenever that happened, this time his search yielded no results. Pearl was gone. He went outside to look for her, in the fields and in the woods, but she was nowhere to be found. First, he panicked. Then he called the police to file a missing persons report. Of course, he couldn't tell the authorities that he suspected his sister to have been abducted by some supernatural entity. He did tell them that she'd been going out at night quite frequently but would usually return in the mornings, and that he was incredibly concerned now. They tried to ease his mind by reminding him that she was basically a grown-up and had probably just gone off somewhere by herself. Of course, that couldn't convince him, as he knew what had really been going on. But he tried not to let it on. Not much of an investigation ensued, and of course it brought up nothing. Ben didn't give up though. He kept looking all over the woods, wandering them every day, and eventually going so far as to drive iron nails into trees or mark them with crosses which he scratched into the barks. The weird thing was that a few days later, he would often find that the nails had been removed in his absence. And even the crosses would oftentimes be covered up by additional scratches. He definitely seemed to be bothering somebody by doing what he did. So he decided to keep it up. That was the best thing to do. As it turned out, just a month into this endeavor, Ben was startled awake by the doorbell ringing. The house had been eerily quiet ever since Pearl had disappeared, and the nights he'd spent in there had been laborious. He hadn't slept well since then. Not that he had before, but it had really gotten a good deal worse. On the upside, it was due to that fact that he was on his feet pretty much right away. He didn't know what or whom to expect to come visit at this time, and it was a confused Ben who trudged up to his front door and opened it as far as the door chain would allow it. Behind it, he found a freckled face with dark eyes staring back at him. The father, as Pearl had called him, looked a lot more upset than usual. Ben liked seeing him like that, and he held his gaze for a good 10 seconds. Smiling serenely, "Oh, it's you," he said softly, leaning back against the inside of the doorframe. He was almost in a mood to laugh at this odd, peeved look on the man's face. "Benjamin," the father began, his voice sharp and composed in a forced, strained kind of way, "I think we need to talk. Where's my sister?" "With us." At least he made no moves to deny it. Ben raised a brow at him, hoping to procure a piercing look from his bloodshot eyes. "Let her go and we'll talk all you want. This is not about letting her go. Boy, this is about you running around in my woods. It's utterly useless, and all it does is get on my nerves. My kids don't like it either, including Pearl. Don't you fucking dare call my sister your kid. She is, though. I know you think this is unfair and all, but the fact of the matter is that sometimes certain people aren't meant to be human. They don't want to be either. They wait around for something to come along and free them from their miserable natural existence. And that's what we did. Either you give her back or you piss off right now." Ben growled. The father sighed. "Again, this isn't about giving her back. I won't. She doesn't even want to come home. She's happier with us. Then you're gonna see more of me in your woods," Ben replied, smiling mirthlessly as he slammed the door in the man's face. He was unsettled. Deeply so. But he knew better than to give in just like that. He kept on with his visits to the forest. And he noticed with delight that he kept getting visitors to his own home as well. He didn't know if it was the father or something else like him. But he could see figures rushing past his bedroom window at night, sometimes. He could even hear them whisper. Occasionally, there'd be knocks on the front door. But he didn't go to open it after that first conversation with the creep. Then one morning, he found that they'd deposited a few bones on his windowsill. The morning after, there were a couple more bones. And after that a skull, and even more bones still. He collected them in a cardboard box which he stashed away in Pearl's old room. He put the rock he'd kept from back when he was little in there as well. He knew what they were trying to tell him. They wanted to make him believe there was no saving his sister. He didn't buy it, and he soon saw that he was right not to. A week later, he saw the ghostly apparition resembling her at his window for the very first time. She screamed at him to leave, but he didn't. The real Pearl would never tell him to go, and he'd never let her down. She was everything to him. And he'd always been there for her. That, he told himself, would never change. Finally, the father came through. He came to visit Ben in broad daylight, and he told him he'd let Pearl go. But that he wanted to be paid in return. A ransom, basically, only that he wouldn't have it in money, but in everything else that was valuable, precious stones, silver, gold. He told him exactly how much of that he wanted. But Ben wouldn't relay that information to me. Only that he was quite close to having gathered all that was required. I'm guessing he thought I could never make it. He told me as we sat on his sofa. But, well, as you can see, I found a way. Sure, I take some of the extra money I make and spend it on what I need. Or want. 'Cause I think I'd go crazy otherwise, but yeah. I'm almost there. This is gonna be over soon. Carrie. Ben and I both got a little upset after he'd finished sharing his story. I swear I hadn't meant to aggravate him. He was having a difficult enough time as it was. After he'd explained everything to me, I was kind of dumbstruck. All I could do was sit beside him in silence for a little while. I wanted to tell him how sorry I was for everything that he'd been through, and that I was honestly kind of amazed by his perseverance. Instead, I just patted his arm. For a while, neither of us said anything. You know, he suddenly spoke up. His voice was a bit hoarse and he paused to clear his throat. Sometimes I really regret not going about this any differently. Back when she kept leaving at night, I could have followed her. Maybe if I'd seen where she'd been going off to, I would have known where to look after she vanished. There's some truth in that, but I doubt you would have gotten very far. Ben snorted. Oh wow, thanks. No. What I'm saying is I don't think you could have stopped it. Those things aren't human and they work in weird ways. So if you ask me, it would have happened either way. They wouldn't have let you come after them. So you couldn't have helped it. Ben let out a soft sigh. You've got a point, and you shouldn't beat yourself up about this. I carried on. Don't blame yourself for what you might not have thought of back then. No need. I'm trying not to, emphasis on trying. I know it's not gonna help. But that doesn't change the way I feel. Neither will you telling me. Sweet of you as it is. I thought for a few minutes. Ben, please don't take this the wrong way. But what if the father didn't actually lie to you and Pearl doesn't want to come back? Ben recoiled so strongly that I could actually see him tremble. "Why would you say that?" he asked, looking like a kicked puppy. "I'm sorry. Please, please don't get upset. It's just something we should think about." With the way you described her reaction, maybe it's been her at the windows and she really doesn't want you looking for her. "I don't, that's..." He started talking like that a few times, only to stop and try again whenever his voice faltered. "It's not like that," he finally said. "I'm sure it's not." "Then what about the deal itself? What if those weird demon people are only tricking you?" "Hard to believe in their goodwill." "I know," he muttered. "It's a risk, but it's my only shot." "I get that," I replied. We both fell silent. I knew I'd just made him think of something he'd been trying to keep off his mind. "Let's be careful, okay? You think I'm not?" Ben asked, glaring at me. "Define careful. But if we're talking overthinking every single move I make, lying awake at night and being afraid of my neighbors, then I'm the most careful guy there is." "I didn't mean you aren't thinking this through," I told him, equal parts concerned and slightly annoyed. "I know you don't even want to think about this. And I understand. But it's no use getting pissy just because I'm worried for you." "Worried? Huh?" he repeated blankly. "Are you sure you would even hang out with me if it wasn't for my money?" Now that got me angry. "Are you serious? I'm trying to be a good friend and you're putting it like I'm not even." "You know what? In the future, keep your money." Ben started. "So you don't want to come over anymore?" "No, I do still want to come over. I just don't want you paying me for it," I answered. "Maybe then you'll take me seriously." "All right," he muttered, deflated. "That's really nice of you. I don't want to stop giving you money though." He took a deep breath. "I said that before 'cause I was. I don't actually mean it. I kinda like giving you money and stuff. It makes me feel good. It's weird, I know, but I've always done this. Even back with Pearl when she did well in school. Gifts and trips. Everything's money. It's probably no good that everything's money to me." He fell silent again. "Can I tell you something silly?" "Go ahead. Don't laugh at me. But one of the reasons why I wanted to get to know you was because, see, he paused, stifling a chuckle. "I thought you were one of them." "What? Why?" "Okay. For one, it's the whole smiling thing. I won't lie. I thought it was a bit eerie. Kinda unearthly like. I mean, who the hell is happy enough to grin all day long? Plus, it's sort of in the name. Caradwin, you know. Well, you can thank my father for that. He's a mythology nut." I smirked. "So I'm a witch, huh? Oh, wait, that's what you meant when you said you were afraid of your neighbors earlier." "Shut up," he grumbled, turning his head. I laughed for a few seconds, before suddenly stopping. I was overcome by an incredibly alien, misplaced sense of dread. Ben turned to give me a questioning look. I chewed on my lower lip in thought before facing him in return. "You okay?" "I just had this really weird feeling," I muttered. "I just thought, this isn't gonna end well." "Is it? What is?" he asked. "This. The two of us," I replied, pointing between him and me. "I can't really explain it. It's just like, I kinda feel like something bad is gonna happen. Might just be the nerves. Don't you think?" I shrugged, forcing a smile. "Probably." So after that, things went on as usual for a long time. Maybe a whole year, actually. We spent time the way we used to, and Benjamin insisted on continuing to pay me. He assured me it was a comfort to him, being able to look after me and support me to some extent. I had been honest with him, by the way. I would have stayed around even if he hadn't compensated me for my company. During this time, I occasionally saw the screaming girl in the windows as well, though I doubted it was some kind of shapeshifter. Ben wouldn't hear any of it, but I just had a feeling it was his sister. Then again, my thoughts on the matter didn't really change things. I also got used to the sight of Ben coming home with Daisy's special pig food, even though it was still something I hated thinking about at length. Butler stayed with us, or rather in Ben's stables, and despite his eerie origins, I'd come to think of him as a cute pet more than anything else. We also tried to figure out what kind of horse he actually was. We never figured it out for real since we both aren't experts, but we think he could be a Shire, Clydesdale or Percheron. Perhaps he really isn't any normal breed though, considering who he used to belong to. The possibility of him just being a weird demon horse is not far-fetched. Is it? What I'm about to tell you happened while I was outside with him. I was riding him over the wide, soft earthy path running alongside the fields. It had been a pretty normal day thus far, and other than the sky being clouded heavily enough that no bright rays of sunlight could come through, the weather was unremarkable. Butler carried me along at a casual pace, mild and calm as always. That's also why I started when he stopped abruptly. We'd gotten fairly close to the woods and he seemed to be staring off at the tree line. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked. No answer, of course. I patted his wide neck, then got off to take a closer look. His ears were tipped forward, stiff and attentive. His nostrils flared. He looked nervous somehow. "You seen something?" I added, turning to face the tree line like he was to figure out what he was staring at. I didn't see anything at first, until my eyes met with a figure just as it drew back and disappeared in the darkness. I frowned. Had it only been a trick of the light? Butler exhaled sharply and swung his head around to nudge my shoulder, like he wanted to get my attention. He turned on the spot, appearing to feel like going home, but stopping to wait for me. I knew I couldn't get back on top of him, or at least not on my own. I didn't waste any time scrambling up there, especially since he was really uneasy. Instead, I proceeded to lead him back down the path we'd come from at a brisk pace, glancing over my shoulder from time to time. I had only seen this person, if it really was one, for a split second, but something about it had unnerved me. Knowing what went on around the farm, I didn't want to take any risks. Butler himself seemed very eager to get back, and I had trouble keeping up with him and his long legs. Eventually we both went, "Fuck it," at the same time and broke into somewhat of a sprint. Butler thankfully being kind enough not to run along at full speed. He would have dragged me through the dirt behind him before long. It's not exactly easy jogging with a huge horse at your side, but at least we both knew where we were going. Arriving at the stables, I got him inside and remained there for long enough to make sure he was doing all right. He had visibly calmed down and returned to his normal, tranquil self. Reassured, I headed inside. Ben wasn't home at the time. He'd asked me to house watch while he was gone visiting some relative whose wife had just given birth. Or at least that's what I believe he told me. I never did get the hang of that complex web of family members he was on the outskirts of. I was mildly shocked that he insisted on being there for every major event in their lives, after not having been there to support him in his hour of need. You'd think he'd stay as far away from them all as he could. And yet he faithfully attended birthdays, reunions, weddings and funerals despite of, or maybe rather because of his grudge. I ought to be better than them after all, he explained to me briefly one day. I want to show them how it's done. Can't tell them they fucked up when I'm not doing it any differently. So off to travel he was. I already mentioned I didn't mind having his place to myself from time to time. After making use of his bathroom upon my return, I went down into the kitchen to get a bite to eat before settling down on the sofa in the living room. I was still a little on edge due to Butler's demeanor and the figure by the tree line from before. But I forgot about it pretty quickly. Not that unusual around these parts. The whole thing. I was feeling a bit lonely though, so I ended up calling Ben to see if he had time to chat. He had. Apparently he was in his room at the inn where he was staying at the time and didn't have much to do. He told me he was going to drive home that same night. That boring? I asked. I mean, it's a baby. They don't do much. It's, like, kinda cute and I got to hold it, but other than that, nothing happened. He chuckled. I showed up. That's what counts. How's things at home? Did you burn the house down yet? I informed him that it was still standing, but also about what Butler and I had seen on our outing. Ben seemed uneasy at this, despite telling me it was probably okay. Nothing unusual, just as I myself had thought. Ah well, I was gonna come home soon anyways. Just stay safe. Alright? Of course. I'll see you then. I was just about to end the call when his voice rang out once more. Hey, Carrie? I halted. Yeah? I heard him swallow and exhale slowly. I was gonna say something but I forgot. Normally, I would have probably thought that was funny. But he was speaking so softly that it was almost frightening me. Sweetie, are you okay? Remember how we talked about, well, everything that happened to me? In the end, you said that you had a feeling that it wasn't going to end well for the two of us. This whole thing. That is, I remember. I said slowly. I had the exact same feeling just now. I won't lie and say that this didn't make me nervous. After ending the call, I sank down on the sofa, pulling my knees to my chest. I considered going back over to my uncle's place. I really didn't want to be by myself. The problem was that the thought of going outside frightened me just as much. So I stayed where I was. Watching TV made it all a bit easier, and I was just beginning to relax again when I heard something clatter somewhere on the floor above me. I jumped to my feet, standing in the middle of the living room. I listened intently. Maybe I'd misheard. My hopes were crushed when there was a loud creaking noise. It's difficult to describe the movement of a sound, but this one seemed to wander across the length of the ceiling, which I stared up at with wide eyes. Someone was walking around up there. My mind raced, and for a moment, my head started to swim. My vision blurred shortly before clearing up again. I'd gotten better at keeping my cool. Or rather, that's what I would have liked to think. It was hard to ignore the pounding of my heart in my chest as I rushed into the kitchen. My first instinct being to grab a knife. The only thing I could think of being able to defend myself with that was within quick reach. I hurriedly pulled a slim, yet long and very sharp-looking one out of the block of knives on the kitchen counter. Being armed, I already felt a tad better. Slinking back out into the hallway, I glanced up the stairs. The second floor looming almost threateningly overhead. I should have taken flight immediately. However, I decided I'd go up the stairs as far as possible without making any noise and sneak a peek at the intruder. After all, I wasn't really expecting a normal burglar. Or at least not the human kind. I just had to see who it was. I crept up to the second floor as quietly as I could. The footsteps grew louder and more distinct as I approached the hallway. Whoever was in the house with me wasn't even trying to be silent, making me wonder if they thought it was empty. By then I could also tell where exactly the sound was coming from. A queasy feeling spread in the pit of my stomach upon finding the door to Pearl's old room ajar. I swallowed and exhaled slowly and deeply as I tried to keep the hand which so nervously held on to the kitchen knife to stop from trembling. Just a peek, I told myself. That would be all. Pressing my back to the wall, I inched closer to the open door at the far end of the hallway. It was right there in front of me, yet in my anxious state appeared to be miles away. Moving towards it in the tiniest, quietest steps, I finally reached it. I could see inside. The lights were on and I could see a shadow move across part of the floor. But the person it belonged to was out of sight. I nudged the door just a bit further open, leaning over to get a better look, only for nothing but part of the desk and bed to come into view. This was getting too risky for me. Peeking wasn't an option anymore. I was just about to turn around and make a break for the door when suddenly, the door was pulled open from the inside and a faintly familiar girl appeared in its frame. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Caradwin." I jumped, stifling a scream but allowing myself a sharp inhale which caused me to choke on my own spit and start coughing. Pearl looked at me with a patient smile as I was trying to catch my breath. "If you're always this bad at sneaking up on people, you're so not cut out for Benji's line of work," she said with playful rebuke once I'd finally gotten a grip on myself. "You know my name?" I pressed out. "Sure I do. I've seen you here often enough." "You've been watching us?" "Of course. Ben probably thinks I'm being kept in some sort of prison and only let out occasionally, but I'm very much able to go wherever I want." She tilted her head at me, even though my brother would never believe it. "How'd you get in?" She pointed at the open window in response. "I'm so good at climbing and entering things," she muttered, visibly pleased with herself. "So you really don't want to come back?" I muttered. I was only mildly surprised at this, but still stunned by her sudden appearance in front of me. Talking to her was beyond weird. She'd always been this specter. A ghost of someone I'd only heard stories about and an apparition that had frightened me whenever I briefly encountered it. This was different though. She was talking to me like a real person. Face to face. Pearl chuckled. "Obviously. Then why didn't you ever just—" "I don't know." "Say so?" I asked, frowning. "Like, you could have talked to Ben, right?" "Could I?" Pearl echoed, shaking her head. "If I went through this door ever again in his presence, he'd keep me here forever. He'd pin me down or, I don't know, nail my arms to the floor or something. He'd never let me go again. As far as talking goes, do you really think he'd believe me saying that kind of thing? He'd think I'm under some sort of spell. Or better yet, that it's not even me in front of him and I'm an imposter or whatever." She let out a mirthless laugh. He might actually try to kill me. That wouldn't work, of course. But I simply don't care to have my brother stab me. There was a lot to what she was saying. I pondered. So you tried to scare him away instead? I tried, yes. Her shoulders sagged and she let out a sigh. Father and I came up with so many schemes and ideas to get him to leave us be. Now, it just hurts to see Benji like this. He's too far gone to be reasoned with. Always has been. Father gave him this impossible task. At least we thought it'd be impossible for him. I mean, we've never been rich, and Ben on his own. We were wrong, of course. I've seen him feed his pigs. He's doing these sucky things because of me. I wish he'd just take all his money, go somewhere else and forget about everything. She took a few steps back into her room and plopped down on her bed, whirling up a small cloud of dust. I cautiously approached her, remaining at a safe distance as I stared down at her. When I first saw you here at my brother's place, I was like, yay, he's got himself a girlfriend. I thought he'd finally started living a little. But you're not like that. And when I realized that, she shook her head. No, I'm not really mad. I don't even know you. I'm just sad you're not what I hoped you were. I'm sorry. I offered. Oh, don't be. You're gonna help him, she said, a sudden cold confidence in her voice. You're gonna help him a great deal. What do you mean? I was starting to get nervous again. I came in here for a reason today. I wanted to speak to you, actually. You're going to come with me. Resistance is, of course, futile. Don't worry though, I'm only borrowing you. I've been planning this for ages. You're just gonna do as I say and then you'll be back home without so much as a scratch on you. I don't think I like where this is going, I remarked in a shaky voice, a flickering, insecure smile on my face. As I said, it's not your choice. She rose to her feet to give me a pat on the shoulder, only to drop her hand to grab my wrist. Her grip was so strong that it sent a sting of pain up my arm. I winced and the knife slid out of my trembling fingers, landing on the floor with a clink. You need to help me help him let go. I don't want to hurt you, Pearl told me. There was an urgency in her voice that made it difficult not to believe her. I would be lying if I said I wasn't terrified though. She reached out and removed my cell phone from my shirt pocket. She fumbled around with it a little before giving up and telling me to unlock it and call Ben. I lifted my phone to my ear with a nervously shaking hand. What am I supposed to tell him? I whispered. I can't tell you. You'll sound more afraid if you don't find the words right away. I am afraid, I whimpered, listening to the ringing at my ear until Ben finally answered the call. Carrie, I'm kinda on the road right now. I got you on speaker, but I should really, can I call you back? No, don't go. Ben, I paused, desperately trying to think of something to say. How was I to explain that his missing sister of all people had broken into his house and was now more or less violently forcing me to do something I still didn't understand? Are you okay? You sound. I cut him off. It's your sister. I breathed. Pearl. She's here. She let herself in. I don't know what she wants, but it's her. It's really her and I'm scared. For a few seconds, all was silence. Finally, I heard him clear his throat. What? Ben, you gotta believe me, I began, but was interrupted by Pearl snatching the phone out of my hand. You heard her, she said, sounding almost cold. "If you want to see her again, get home quick. We'll be waiting." My heart dropped, and not just at the sound of her words. Ignoring her brother's stammering on the other end, Pearl ended the call with an icily determined tap of her finger. She then dropped my phone onto her old bed before turning back to me with a stiff smile. She grabbed me by the wrist again, her slender fingers feeling like screws pressing into my skin. I let out a low squeak of pain, but her grip remained firm and uncaring. "Don't run out on me," she ordered cheerfully. She started dragging me along, out of the room and down the stairs. I struggled against her grip, but she was incredibly strong. I figured it was most likely something to do with her changed nature. But I still tried to wriggle myself free. By the time I finally managed to extract my wrist from her steel fingers, she had already pulled me all the way out into the fields. The sky above was even darker than before, and it looked like there'd be a thunderstorm coming on soon. It had apparently already rained while I'd been inside, since I could feel the wet grass whipping against my ankles and leaving clammy traces of water. Pearl turned to me with an impatient look on her face, and I heard thunderclapping in the distance. "Don't run away," she commanded, adding a strained "please" out of sheer conscientiousness. "I really don't want to go and catch you. I told you I don't want to hurt you. Why are you doing this to him?" It was the first thing that came to my mind. My head was still spinning, and it was difficult to collect my thoughts. But I just had so many questions. All he's ever wanted was to protect you. He loves you so much. You're all he's got. And you. I don't want to be all he's got. Pearl snapped. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly, and I noticed her clenching and unclenching her fists, almost like she was trying to steady herself. "You have to understand," she went on, a bit calmer. "He's my big brother. Of course I love him too. But I just didn't want to live like that anymore. I know he tried his best to make me feel better about all this shit, but I was miserable. And no matter what he tells himself, so was he. Do you really think a young man in his early 20s wants to take care of his baby sister? He did an amazing job, but that doesn't change the fact that my life sucked. I had no real family. I never got over Dad's death, and secretly, I kept on hoping that someday, Mom would just magically reappear and make everything better. Ben did what he could, but he wasn't a mom or a dad. He was just this young, helpless man who tried to get himself and me along. All he ever talked about was how I needed not to let anything get to me, and how I had to have a better future and just forget about everything." She paused to catch her breath, not having stopped to take one during her entire speech. "This is better than anything I could have ever had. It's exciting and different, and I have nothing to lose anymore. I don't have to work or study my ass off like I did." How do I even explain this? She stopped again, swallowing and clearing her throat. "Who cares what you think? You've been using Ben this whole time. If you're talking about the money, I only took what he offered me. It was his idea. I even told him I didn't want it anymore and that we could be normal friends, but he said he didn't want that." I cried out. She'd hit a nerve, and a very sore one too. The better Ben and I had gotten to know each other, the more I'd hated taking his money. And yet he'd always insisted, and I couldn't deny I needed the money. I'd kept on working even when Ben paid me. One can't live on an allowance alone. Still, it was his doing that from the day we started our arrangement. I'd lived a much more comfortable life than ever before, and part of me was happy not to give up on that. The rest of me felt shitty about it. Of course not. He throws money at everything he loves. Listen, I don't care why you spend time with him. I'm honestly just glad you've been distracting him. He clearly enjoys your company, and ever since you've been around, he just seems so much more, I don't know, happy, hopeful. So this is what we're gonna do. Father will make it look like we're holding you hostage. You are kind of holding me hostage, I interrupted her, and we'll give Ben the choice. Either he leaves you to rot or he gets you back unharmed for no precious stones or other valuables at all. But in exchange he gives up on me forever. My jaw and stomach dropped at the same time, and for a second, I just stood rooted to the spot. You'll what? I uttered. Isn't it obvious? Pearl asked, raising a brow. He's gonna choose you. Once he's given up on me, he'll be free. Sure, he'll be sad at first, but he'll get over it. It'll be the best thing to ever happen to him. I shook my head rapidly. This isn't gonna work, I pressed out. He's never gonna choose me. He will. And don't worry, we'll let you go either way. Father says you wouldn't be fit to live with us. So why waste time on you afterwards? Even if he does, he's not just going to move on. I insisted. Pearl, he's been trying to get you back all his life. If you can't convince him you're happy this way, which you say you can't, then he's not going to get over it. Ever. After something like that, nobody would just shrug and go on with life. Especially not your brother. But it's the only way. Pearl answered, her eyes wide and regretful. After he's given up, you can tell him everything I said to you. You've made him feel better before. You'll do it again. I shook my head. This is a load of crap. It's not gonna work, and you'll break his heart. I'll have no part in this. Pearl's expression darkened. Then this is on you. Before I could do so much as blink, she'd lunged forward, and the last thing I saw before everything turned black was her fist rushing towards my face at an unnatural speed. I don't know how long I was out for. When I finally began to fade back into consciousness, the first thing I registered was the soft, cold, damp ground beneath my body. I was lying in a patch of tall, wet grass. It felt like the turf was giving me a very frosty hug. I then became aware of the throbbing pain in my head. Lifting my eyelids was arduous, and for once I was grateful that there was no bright daylight to greet me. We were still on the meadow beside the fields. From the looks of it, I groaned as I heaved myself up into a sitting position, letting out a meek, startled whimper when I took note of a person approaching and kneeling down in front of me. I squinted at the blurry figure, trying to see through the veil of dizziness. And then, the face before mine suddenly came into clear view. I let out a sharp scream which turned into a low croak as my voice broke off. I had never met this man before, but Ben's stories had instilled within me a fear of him which I had thought up to that point to be unfounded. I was never going to meet him, I figured. Yet there he was now. His dark hair framed a calmly smiling, mature and almost nice-looking face, the skin of which was covered with freckles. "Good evening," he said in a soft, deep voice which was every bit unsettling as it was oddly soothing. He reached out to grab my hand and give it a light shake, clearly not minding the fact that I hadn't offered it to him. "It's Caradwin. Yes, a pleasure to meet you. Please don't do this," I had to force the words out from between my lips. They sounded sad and weary. My daughter has told me of your doubts about her plan. You're understandably afraid and reluctant. But surely you'll see that we need you to go along with this either way. I'm very sorry Pearl had to subdue you like this. But it didn't have to come to that. He spoke with polite, yet somehow immensely threatening rebuke. His voice sent a chill up my spine. How is my horse doing? Benjamin stole it from where I left it down in the woods at the bottom of the hill a long time ago. If you're aware, I miss it, at times. He gave me another thin smile. I thought about taking it back, but I figured Benjamin needed a win. I was too afraid and confused to answer. As soon as Ben would get back, the relative happiness he'd been experiencing would be torn away from him. I didn't even want to think about how he would take it. The father terrified me as well. No doubt about it. But if he or Pearl had actually wanted to kill me, they already would have. That much I knew. All I could do was hug my knees, curling up into a sheepish little ball, praying that it would just be over. When Pearl first noticed you, she would only call you the smiling girl. I told her who you were. I know everyone here. I keep close track of my neighbors. Can I see it? The father asked. What? Can I see your smile? Upon me remaining silent, he added, I'll give you a present if you smile. I choked back a sob. Nevertheless, I forced the corners of my mouth to twitch upwards. The father responded in kind, giving me a wide, pleased smirk. Close your eyes. I did. I felt him shove something into my arms, and upon looking, I found it to be a large, old toy truck. The plastic it was made of was dirty and had not fared well over the years, and it only had 3 wheels left. I instantly wrapped it up into a tight hug, pressing it to my chest. The father grinned and reached into his coat to pull out a piece of ripped cloth which he balled up in his fist. I had a feeling he was going to gag me with it, so I hastily scrambled to my knees. Wait, what even are you? That's not important, he answered calmly. I'm not a human and you're afraid of me, because you cannot hurt or fight me. That's all I need to be to you. You live here, right? Yes, underground. Can't you just go somewhere else with all your kids to get away from Ben instead? He shook his head. You know, I respect Ben in a begrudging sort of way, but I won't let him chase me out of my home. He reached up to poke a finger between my lips. He pushed my mouth open and proceeded to stuff the rag inside. I gagged at the taste of the dirt which clung to it and felt a few tears run down my face. I clutched the toy truck like one would a life belt, as the father moved out of the way to stand next to Pearl. I could see the farmhouse in the distance. I stared at it with a glum sense of hopelessness, starting when I took note of a tall figure moving towards us across the grassy soil. The second Ben came into view, I started to yell at him. Or I tried to. Rather, I could barely get a noise out. I'll admit something to you all now. I don't read a lot of books these days, and when I do, I usually really don't like it when authors simply skip events in a narrative. I tried very hard to turn my memories of this time of my life into a story with an agreeable flow and structure. But I think with this one, I'll allow myself to give it a pass and just make it as short as possible to spare myself some bad memories. The father had picked me up from the ground so that I was standing in front of him while his arms were wrapped around me. I tried to kick him a few times, but he remained unfazed. I felt incredibly helpless. watching Ben trudge up to us. I had been wrong in assuming he'd choose Pearl. He gave up on the deal. The only way to return her to him, after hardly 2 minutes of contemplation. We went back into his house. I parted with the toy truck and placed it on a shelf in the kitchen. Ben didn't say a single word the whole time. He helped me remove the gag, gave me some water, then my phone, which he had probably found investigating Pearl's room, and then sat down across from me to watch me drink. He looked kind of torn, and there was a trace of something in his eyes I'd never actually seen before, contempt. Eventually, he stood up and went back outside, rounding the house to get to the stables. I'd followed him even though he hadn't asked me to, and watched as he opened Butler's box and let him step outside. It's hard to tell when a horse is confused, but I'm pretty sure that Butler, at that moment, really didn't have a clue what was going on. Ben pointed at the fields. "Go back to where you came from. I don't want you anymore." Butler nudged him with his large snout. "Get lost," Ben repeated, mustering up a bit more command. Butler trotted over to me, looking first at Ben and then at me like he was saying, "What's gotten into him?" I reached up to pet him. Ben gave me a wry look before letting out a sigh. "Buddy of mine got stables in a town that's not too far away. He won't want to know where Butler's from if I tell him not to ask." He nodded at Butler. "This one's clearly not leaving, so if you want him, he's yours. Don't worry. I know you're broke. I'll pay. I just want him off my hands." In a way, I was glad he was at least talking to me again. But I also dreaded what he would say next. I gently nudged Butler back into his box where would stay for the time being. I turned back around, feeling like I would shrink under Ben's gaze. He wasn't glaring at me in any kind of openly hostile way, but he simply had this unbelievably hollow look in his eyes. He took a deep breath and then exhaled slowly. "Caradwin, I don't want you to think you did anything wrong. And I don't regret giving up the deal for you." For a split second, I contemplated telling him that they wouldn't have hurt me either way. But that would have been torturing him for no reason whatsoever. I braced myself. "I don't ever want to think of this again. So I'm gonna ask you to leave now. Please do not come back. We might see each other around. But please don't come talk to me. I don't want to see your face or hear your voice ever again." When somebody says that to you, there is no way to misinterpret it. I turned around and walked away, refraining from looking over my shoulder so we wouldn't end up locking eyes. I went home to my uncle, who was already asleep at the time, and after checking up on him, I went into my room, got into bed and simply fell asleep. I started looking for a good job just 1 day later, and after a tediously long search I finally found a very nice, upscale cafe where I was allowed to come in most days of the week and wait tables. The customers were mostly snobs and people who came to impress their dates. But they were polite enough. The pay was good, even when I was only starting out. I liked it there and I still do. Seeing as I work there to this day, I found another place to live as well. I felt like I was done with the countryside for a while. The cafe was closer to the city as well, so moving was actually a pretty logical thing to do. I assured my uncle that I'd call him every day and that I'd visit twice a week. Both things I never failed to do until he died late last December. I remember standing there at the funeral crying, yet at the same time thinking how glad he must have been to be reunited with my aunt. There was one thing I regret though. Before I had moved out, he'd sat me aside and told me that he hoped I would be happier living elsewhere, and that the new job in place would restore some of my old spirit. When I asked him what he meant, he gave a glum nod into the direction of the farmhouse across the street and said, "I don't have to know what happened there, but ever since the last time you came back from that place, you haven't smiled as much as you used to." I had never noticed that I'd stopped smiling. Whenever I went to visit my uncle, I tried to look as happy as I apparently used to. But I don't think he bought it. I wish I could have been a little brighter for him. At least the butler situation worked out splendidly. Ben appeared to have gotten the whole matter sorted with his friend behind the scenes. And all of a sudden, I had a horse. The stables aren't far from where I live now either, so it's easy. Butler is his happy and gentle old self, and it's always a comfort to be around him. Like I said, he has a way of cheering me up. Finally, here's what happened a month ago. It's why I'm writing this. I was at work, bringing people coffee and whatnot, when I noticed that at this one table I was serving, there was someone I recognized. It was Jay, one of Ben's farmhands. I had only seen him a few times, but I still remembered him. He was sitting there with a lady who I assumed to be his girlfriend. And upon noticing me, he waved me over. "I can't believe it's you," he began with zest, only refraining from grabbing my hand because I was still holding a tray. "It's been what, 3 years? I don't even know anymore. How are you?" "I'm all right, thanks," I replied, giving him a genuine smile. "Are you still working for?" "Oh, no, not anymore," he replied, his face darkening. "You didn't hear what happened?" "I'm sorry. Dumb question. How are you supposed to know?" "Benjamin died." I nearly dropped my tray but caught it just in time. Jay gave me a sympathetic nod. "It's awful. I know. He and I weren't close or anything, but he was a good guy. It's a shame." "How did it happen?" I stammered. Jay hesitated. "He jumped off the top of his barn late at night sometime last week. A friend of his found him. He'd been driving by and wanted to come to visit him. I don't know the guy, but I don't envy him. Must have been quite a shock." As for Ben, well, he'd been pretty down for a long time. He used to have quite a bit of energy and a good sense of humor, but sometime during the last couple years, he changed. I was worried. Told him so too. "You coming to the funeral? You think that would be okay?" "Sure, I'll take you." So 2 days later, he picked me up and we drove over to the graveyard back in the old town. It was a cloudy, muggy day. There weren't a lot of people and I didn't recognize most. So I stayed aside with Jay, not wanting to intrude, but I did cry. I kept wondering if Ben would be angry if he knew I showed up to his funeral. He'd never wanted to see me again. After all, at one point, Jay told me he'd be right back before going off somewhere, and I was left alone with my thoughts. Suddenly, I felt a large hand on my shoulder. At first I assumed it was Jay and was about to turn around to him when I heard a voice right by my ear telling me not to. I started. I had heard it before, but I couldn't tell where. The stranger's tone was warm but commanding, so I stayed where I was. Despite my confusion, "Benjamin thought you'd forgotten about him," he said softly. "I knew him from work. He talked about you a lot." "From the farm?" I asked carefully, stifling another sob. "No, not the farm. From feeding the pigs. I almost let out a tiny shriek. Almost. The man carried on. Between you and me, Ben didn't stop feeding the pigs. But a while ago, he asked Daisy, I'm sure you know who that is, if she had some more work for him. Stuff that would pay better. You mean he? The stranger didn't sound distressed at this in the least. If you ask me, after everything he'd been through, he lost track of his moral code a bit. He just didn't care anymore. I think his death had something to do with that. He let out a chuckle. Who knows? Maybe he's still alive and it was all a low-profile fake. It would be easier for him to follow through with this new line of business if he'd just disappeared. My stomach sank at his words. I considered screaming but resisted, only allowing myself to take in a very sharp breath. I remembered the voice now, too. At this point, he slipped a tiny piece of paper into my hand. If there's any way you can look past what I do for a living, call me, just in case you'd like to talk about Ben, or yourself, or anything else. I need to go. Don't, I whispered, reaching up to feel for his hand only to have him pull it away. I really can't stay here, he replied, sounding amused. Did he miss me? Ben, I mean, terribly. With that, he left. By the time Jay returned, he had already disappeared. Nobody had seen him talk to me. He'd come and gone without drawing any attention. I unfolded the paper only to find, as promised, a phone number, written in a majestic hand, with the name Tegged F. Cox beneath it. I tucked it away inside my pocket. I must have looked quite mad, but I simply could not stop smiling during the entire ride home. Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.